Right? Or do you prefer it spread out? It looks more... I think you'll also be able to see better as well.
The material.
Just before we get onto the official introduction to Leon, can you just make a note that the very last seminar, instead of being Monday the 28th of October, has been brought forward to Thursday the 24th of October. The main reason is that Leon's going to be in America at the time to take part in the disinvestment debate. I don't know how many of you have been here on a number of occasions, but the story behind these sessions is quite an interesting one, and I'll just tell you briefly about it in case you don't know it. Some months back, Leon and Eustace is still downstairs working, met an American, a wealthy Texan American who was visiting South Africa, and the story goes that Leon and Eustace discussed the problems of South Africa with him, and this Texan said to them, well, what's the solution? So Leon proceeded to tell him what the solution to South Africa's problems was. And this chap says, well, that's fantastic, but we never hear about this in America. Why don't you write this in a book? And he encouraged Leon to do just that. And so we had the first step towards this book that you're taking part in now. But the next problem was to actually get Leon to sit down to write the book. So Eustace had the brainwave to say to Leon, well, why don't you just sit down for a day and dictate it? You can probably do that, he said. And Eustace says, and Leon said to Eustace, but I can't. It's very cold. I get bored just sitting and talking into a dictaphone all day. He says, what I need is an audience, somebody who I can relate to and so on. So Eustace, not prepared to let him off the hook, so easily said to him, okay, well, I'll provide the audience and you give the talks. So that's exactly what you people are here for. You're the other half of this book. And it's very important that you take part in the discussion, because Leon wants the feedback, and I know it is important. I mean, when I wrote my book a year or so ago, I had a couple of seminars, and it's tremendously supportive to know that what you're saying is not going to be taken as completely absurd or what have you. This problem of getting across our ideas, I believe, is really a continuous one. We've got to keep on and on fighting. And I want to just refer you, if you haven't seen the Sunday Times article of a week ago, where it says that government put free market on ice. I suppose most of you have seen it, but I'll just read you two of the paragraphs, which are rather upsetting. Special circumstances have forced a retreat from deregulation and free market principles in economic management. This was said by Chris Stoltz, who's the Director General of Finance. Stoltz admits that the authorities have been under strong pressure from economists and businessmen to switch from free market economics to controls and more active management by the government. Now, the article goes on to explain why they think that's important. And it seems to me that we're facing a real battle over the next few years, and I think that this book that Leon's writing will contribute to it. And in fact, I think we're also lucky that Leon's on the side of the good guys rather than the side of the bad guys. Perhaps you also, I mean, I have a lot of contact with Leon, so I'm aware of many of the behind-the-scenes activities that he takes out. And I was speaking to somebody early on and saying that, you know, some people don't know of the Free Market Foundation. And it's because of this, a lot of the effort is put into behind the scenes. And Ian Hetherington was, Ian was just telling me this morning of how he had arranged for Leon to go and take part in a discussion in Pietermaritzburg. It was last week, Ian? Thursday. And, you know, Ian just explained to me that Leon sort of sat for the first hour and then started giving his viewpoint. And this was incidentally a discussion to talk about deregulation, or introducing deregulation into Natal and KwaZulu. And the audience was about 50 officials and bureaucrats and so on. And Ian tells the story that, in fact, after listening to Leon for some time, virtually everybody, except I think one person, was convinced that that was the way they had to go. Now, that doesn't get splashed about in the headlines at all, and that's, I think, one of Leon's tremendously strong points, is his intellectual ability and his persuasive powers. And tonight he's going to then carry on with it's the fifth session, which is the legal order. I see this as probably one of Leon's major contributions to the understanding of the libertarianism or free market. I don't know if he would agree with him, but he has, over the past few years, certainly made it clear to me how important the legal order, in particular the common law, is, which obviously you're going to hear more about now. And incidentally, John Hospers has written a paper, which the monograph, which the Foundation is going to be publishing very shortly, dealing with the subject. So Leon's now going to talk about the legal order, and please get your pens out and ask as many questions afterwards, or put across all your controversial points, because that's really what you're here for. Leon, Tom.
Thank you. I have been criticized by Terry. I invited him to mention it, but he didn't. I have been criticized by Terry that in the last sessions I spoke too long and didn't allow enough discussion. A friendly, constructive criticism, which I think is correct, so I'm going to try and be briefer today, and do want you to please... Where won't it go? There it goes. Interject me as I go. We don't need to wait till the end, and I will try to be briefer. And although, as Terry said, this is my favorite subject, it's one that I'm going to have to be somewhat shorter on. The problem with the legal order, that is the kinds of laws that I think a future South Africa has to have, is that in terms of my own political model, the canton system, I propose that each one is free to adopt its own laws. So that what this amounts to is the proposal one would make for each canton to adopt. I also propose that each canton would have, or each state or whatever, each constituent unit would have, potentially by way of referendum, its own constitution. And one would actually be arguing that they adopt a constitution that entrenches or corresponds to the legal order or the jurisprudence which I'm about to propose. It's conceivable that many or most or some or all will reject it and will end up with 200 or 300 or whatever Marxist, fascist, whatever cantons. That is a risk one runs, and I happen to think the chances of something like that happening are so close to zero that I'm entirely confident at giving total autonomy to each canton. The reason why one can be confident of that is that in all the experience at our disposal, where there has been devolution of power, that power has been used towards what we believe to be a democratic or free or individualist society. And the classic example, of course, is Switzerland, but also the United States, Australia, Britain, and other countries demonstrate that a higher degree of devolution tends to be a guarantor of personal freedom. Milton Friedman and Hayek, in fact, believe that it is a total degree of preservation of personal freedom. Milton Friedman's view is that federation per se, with freedom of movement of people in and out, is enough to guarantee freedom. Whether one's right or wrong is a matter of conjecture, but he thinks it is. I'm interested to note, incidentally, that this is the smallest turnout we've had so far. They were getting bigger till last time. Last one was the biggest numerically, which was the solution. Now, presumably, since I've either solved the problem to everyone's satisfaction, there's no need to come back anymore, or alternatively, the solution didn't appeal to anyone, so they've decided not to come to the rest. But it is, perhaps the legal order does sound a little boring, and it's more exciting for jurists. But what I'm going to do before getting onto it is, in the paper during the last week in the press, there's been something about Dennis Beckett's new book, and it turns out by complete coincidence that Dennis Beckett, editor of Frontline, has proposed in his book, which is incidentally on sale here today at the back there at 15 Rand a copy, and I'd strongly recommend that you all get one. Given that Dennis Beckett himself comes from a fairly radical left-wing personal conviction historically, I think the shift in his own thinking towards free market libertarian ideas is quite significant. His ideas are so very close to mine, in spite of the fact that they were called by himself outlandish. I don't think that was a correct description, that it's quite extraordinary. And the other thing is they're so very close to those of the Pretoria University, the Tukkies group, BEPA, which consists of the most prominent figure of whom is Jan Lombard, our president as it happens, but involves a collection of about a dozen academics at Pretoria University in this thing called the Bureau for Economic and Political Analysis, which is the English translation of Bureau van Economische and Politica Analyse. It's not quite that, but it's almost like that. Anyhow, so what I'm going to start with is give you essentially the differences between the Lombard, Beckett and Louw position. The Beckett book, I must tell you, I have read this afternoon, and I haven't read it thoroughly, so I might have some of the detail wrong. Lombard's ideas I know mainly from conversation with him. I have not read his full report that recently came out, but I have read the ASSOCOM summary, and I have here what I believe to be the essential differences between them. Can everyone see that? Lombard's in favor of fairly large states. He's not quite sure, or the BEPA people do not propose precisely how you would divide up the country, but they go along essentially with something like the development regions that we have at the moment, of which there are 8, I think. Is that correct? If it's not 8, it's close to 8. They would, in their states, have perhaps even something like the Free State would be one of the constituent states. I mean, they could be quite large and include quite a few millions of peoples. Dennis Beckett is in favor of what he calls maximal democracy, which is a rather nice term. I quite like it. And his maximal democracy isn't as maximal, I don't think, as mine. But anyway, it's maximal in the sense that he hasn't concretized exactly what he means by the units in his scheme of things in his book. But he would literally have suburbs, Houghton and Melrose and West Dean and Rondebosch and whatever, Dubé, suburbs of Soweto, where tremendous local powers are vested. It's not clear, and he came to see me this afternoon, and I asked him very specific questions, like, for example, what happens if Dubé Township, Soweto, decides to abolish import duties? I mean, and he just really hadn't thought that through. His view, not that he hadn't thought it through, what he argued was that with a considerable degree of devolution, and he doesn't propose that this all gets spelt out in fine detail in a constitution. He thinks the constitution won't help very much. He thinks you need more of a spontaneous popular opinion, that in fact people will behave rationally. So he's got a lot of confidence in the fact that if there's enough devolution, enough maximal democracy, enough voting, enough tiers of government, it will automatically, by virtue of political competition, which all of us, Lombard and I, also attach a lot of weight to this idea of political competition, like free market competition, that this will automatically produce coordinated, sensible, balanced policies. Rationalization, for example, of services, so that if Melrose Township isn't going to try and have its own international airport, it's going to enter into some kind of deal with Kempton Park, for example, that they'll use Jan Smuts. But he doesn't think it can be prescribed, whereas Lombard and I tend to think you A, can, and B, must, that you must actually have some kind of constitution that spells it all out and people vote for it, and if it's adopted, you've got it. He thinks you can't do that, it just has to be some sort of spontaneous order. Now, ironically, here comes an ex-Marxist, and let me give you an idea of how Marxist he was. Whether he ever called himself a Marxist, I'm not sure. But when World got banned, the black newspaper that Percy Quiboza used to edit, and they restarted it up as Post, Jimmy Kruger, at the time of the Soweto riots, said to Percy Quiboza, I'll allow you to start up and I won't ban you, provided you don't have that Marxist Dennis Beckett on your staff anymore. He was regarded as the most radical left of all of the journalists there. Now he comes out and he's got such confidence in competition and devolution that he's even more confident, if you like, than us libertarian free marketeers, because he says you don't need it in a constitution. Enough political competition and you'll get the right results. You don't even need any constitution at all. He sort of says, like Britain doesn't have one. Why many countries don't have one, we don't need one. It should just be by popular movement. He does make a valid point that in the Eastern Cape, essentially that's what's happening, is the local communities are now actually just getting together and sorting out their own affairs. I don't know to what extent it's working, but apparently there's a sort of spontaneous local community resolution of conflict taking place there between the whites and the blacks and various communities. Anyway, he's got 5 tiers of government. He's got, if you like, suburbs at one level, and he doesn't prescribe who has what powers, what lawmaking powers, how the laws are made or whatever. And then he's got towns, then he's got districts, then he's got regions, and then he's got central government. Between regions and central government, he might have even bigger regions or provinces, so he might have 5, 6 or even 7 tiers of government. And his view is the more proliferation of institutions of government you have, and the more levels you have, and the further down the power goes, the better. Whereas my approach is 2 levels of government, cantons with central government, and within the cantons you will have further devolution. Each canton in my model will have its own degree of devolution. You could have a canton like, there's some states that don't even have municipalities, small countries. Liechtenstein, for example, there's no municipal system. Malta, there's no municipal system, there's only just one government, one tier, full stop. Now the canton could run itself like that, or it could have 3 or 4 tiers beneath it, but what happens in the canton and the tiers of government within the canton are its affair, in my approach, not the central government affair. And there would be a diversity, whereas he would have one system, mine would be differ from canton to canton. Lombard would have voting for central government, Beckett would have voting for central government, I would not. Mine would be according like Switzerland, where there's no voting for central government, but according to a formula, which formula would avoid domination by groups of cantons with majority interests against groups of cantons without. Lombard would have some kind of qualified franchise or vote. Beckett and I would have everyone having the vote. The degree, the type of qualification Lombard proposes, I don't think they have specific recommendations on, but it would be, for example, a vote according to land ownership or tax payment or whatever, some kind of qualified franchise. Beckett and I are of the view that that is unsaleable politically. In other words, if you try and have a qualified franchise, you simply will not bring an end to the unrest and the conflict, even if it's desirable. The people, the blacks, the radicals, etc., the international community simply won't accept it. We need a formula that is saleable so as to bring about real peace. Common law, Lombard and I are in favour of common law, Beckett is in favour of positive law, and we'll see later on what the differences are. That's actually quite a very big fundamental philosophical departure point, which probably Lombard comes from a Afrikaner nationalist persuasion to this sort of view. I come from for some years a libertarian persuasion, originally an Afrikaner nationalist, then I was a Wits commie, and now I'm a libertarian. But Beckett comes from a radical left persuasion, and the difference really is that the conservative or traditional view favours common law, the Marxist central planning approach. That's probably a reflection of the points from which the 2 have come, or the 3 of us have come. Lombard and I are in favour of actually having free market legal institutions, which we would recommend. If we can't sell them, well then one will accept that different cantons will depart from them, or the whole country for that matter. Beckett doesn't have a view. He just says that whatever emerges he will live with. It's sort of, as I said, this incredible faith in just simply a sort of spontaneous political order rather than a designed political order. And I must say, in the last hour or 2, it was an hour ago that I spoke to him, I've had to ask myself whether, in fact, what we understand to work in markets, he seems to think works politically in its purest form, as we think it works. Some of us think it works in markets, and maybe he's right. That's something I'm going to digest very thoroughly and discuss with him. He and I and Lombard are going to, I think, deliberately continue to disagree so that people can say, well, the future of South Africa is one of these three options, you see, and that's the only place you can go and see to what extent we can. I think actually that happens to be true. I seriously believe anyone who doesn't want something within this sort of paradigm is dreaming. I doubt very much whether anything else is realistic. Lombard's sort of half libertarian, that is, he goes along with most of the civil liberties as well as the economic freedoms, things like habeas corpus, freedom of the press, freedom of association, movement, freedom of speech, and all of those things, whereas I am libertarian, that is, civil and economic liberties combined, whereas Beckett is sort of statist. In other words, again, ties in with his positive law approach that the state will decide, and the state can decide anything. He's not particularly in favor of a libertarian or a non-libertarian solution. Then Lombard is in favor of some kind of ethnicity in dividing up the cantons. Beckett is totally against ethnicity, wholly geographic, and my approach is that it depends on the evidence. It's an open question. I said that I would be in favor of a judicial delimitation commission that can take whatever evidence anyone wants to lead, including evidence of ethnicity. In other words, if people can show in the evidence that a non-ethnic division or boundary is going to be bad for whatever reasons, well, then that must be weighed up against the other evidence before the Judicial Commission. For example, economic considerations, social considerations, geographic considerations, and so on. So everything goes in my scheme of things, and it's not settled by politicians, but settled by jurists or by judges. Then I'm going to come back to this I used in the very first talk, and this is essentially I'm going to be using, as I come to the judicial order, the legal order, terms that have to be explained in advance. I divide up what I call the free and unfree society paradigms into two essential schools of thought, and I think that all human beings really have to choose one or the other. I know that it's typical when people like me have been at seminars and debates for some clever soul at the end to stand up and say, well, you know, we mustn't be extremists, we must all settle for the middle golden mean sensible balance between the two. In fact, you can't do that. You have one or other inclination, philosophical paradigm, school from which you come. You are a person who is pro the individual, pro rights, or you are a person who is generally for sacrificing the individual in order to promote the group, the country, the nation, or whatever. And I think it seems to me, unless you really are schizophrenic, that you've got to be essentially one or the other. I don't understand how one can be anywhere else. You're either just a sort of ruthless pragmatist, or you're somebody who's got some kind of philosophical belief in the individual. Sorry? Yes, there's nothing anti-individual about the family, in the same way there's nothing anti-individual about a culture or a society or a city. But the question is, in your legal order, in your own mind, you have to have some kind of position as to whether you think voluntary behavior is a virtue or whether coercive behavior is a virtue. You have to have a view on whether you think a designed, engineered society is a desirable society, the beehive or termite heap society is a preferable society, or whether an undesigned, spontaneous society is a preferable society. For example, a society in which there may well be hippies, bums, village idiots, or a society in which you simply try and engineer it so that that never happens. In other words, the Marxist society or the democratic society. I'll come to right at the end as to why I don't think you can be in the middle, but let's look at these ideas. Freedom and oppression, voluntarism and coercion. In other words, in a free society, you either act according to consent or by command. People are commanded to do things, or they consent to whatever they do. In a free society there is choice. In an unfree society you are resigned to whatever comes your way. In a free society it is contractual. People may contract freely. In an unfree society there is regulation of relationships between people rather than contractual relationships. There's a spontaneous order in a free society and an imposed order in an unfree society. Or central planning in the unfree and personal planning, if you like, or individual planning or local planning in the free society. In the free society there's a rule of law or common law. In an unfree society there's positive law or statute law. Now that is what the essence, the heart of all this is. The common law is the law that everyone understands automatically to be the appropriate law. Now, you and I know, everyone in this room will know if Terry or I are violating one or the other's rights. We can all stand in this room, we can move around, and some point will emerge at which the general view is that one of us has acted wrongly towards another. We have robbed the other, assaulted the other, spat in the other's face, clobbered them on the head, or whatever. But generally the common law is, if you like, innate in all human beings. It's that law which every single human being accepts as correct. Shouldn't rob, assault, rape, steal, whatever. And it's universally true, regardless of where you are in the world, in the Amazon jungle, Outer Mongolia, Tibet, the New Hebrides, whether you're a bushman in the middle of the Kalahari, there are certain tenets of the rule of law that are virtually universally accepted by all societies and all people. And that's the so-called natural law, rule of law, whatever, common law. Whereas the positive law approach, or the statute law approach, is that the law is whatever someone decides it is. If the people who have the most power physically, the most guns, the most dynamite, the most whatever, the most police, decide the law is that you may not sell me soap after 6 p.m., well then that's the law. And there's no morality in it. There's no good or bad law. The law is whatever it is. If the law says you may not run a pirate taxi or there's rent control, well that's the law. There's no objective criterion according to the positive law people who tend to be socialist or Marxist or interventionist or social democrat. In a free society there's a minarchy, that is minimal archy, archy meaning government in Greek, little government. In an unfree society there is lots of government, or government is the object, people are the means. Government is the end, the individual is the means to the end. Democracy versus bureaucracy, a free society is governed by voting, preferably in my view referendum on specific issues that have to be or are in fact collectively determined. Whereas in an unfree society they are determined by bureaucrats, the rule of men again rather than the rule of law, and you have lots of, typically in an unfree society, empowering legislation. Excuse the spelling, I did this very quickly. You have an empowering legislation whereby the bureaucrat can make law, make regulations, make directives, whatever. Now let me give you an example of man-made law, bureaucratically derived law. When the Road Transportation Act, on which Terry wrote his book, simply says that a group of people can decide whether or not a permit is to be issued. It is entirely up to them. They don't have to give reasons. It's their own choice. That can be done because they don't like the color of your face or the length of your hair or the smile or whatever. Whereas democracy implies some kind of objective law, where the principles are objectively laid down and everyone applies equally. It's like a rugby match in which the rules are objective. The referee is got to do his best to apply them impartially, as opposed to a rugby match in where the referee decides who may score points, how many points you get if you score a try compared to you. If I kick the ball out of touch, I get 1 point. You've got to kick it over the poles first, etc. That would be the equivalent in society. Individualism versus collectivism, the point about a free society is not whether people behave communally like the family, getting back to your thing, but the point is whether they are recognized by the law as individuals. Individualism at law compared to collectivism at law, and racism is a form of collectivism. I remind you that I pointed out that the radical left black groupings like a ZAPO are just as racist, being black power, as the radical white right-wing groups like the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging are in favor of white rule, the ZAPO in favor of black rule. They're equally collectivist by nature. They don't recognize the individual, but the color of the individual. The free society emancipates the individual, the unfree society is paternalistic, the free society has benevolence and charity, the unfree society is welfarism, plunder, coercive redistribution as opposed to voluntary redistribution. The free society is competitive, the unfree society is monopolistic, the ultimate monopoly of course being the state in a totally unfree society, which is the sole employer, supplier, etc. In fact, if ever you hear us left-wingers saying they're against monopoly, very simple question is to ask, then why then are they socialists? Because the socialist is the ultimate perfection of the concept of monopoly. The diversity of an unfree society is characterized by diversity, the free society unfree by monotony and uniformity in laws as well as in the social fabric. For example, in the free society you would have a diversity of laws at local government. You wouldn't just have one law universally imposed upon all communities, regardless of whether they're first or third world, how developed or undeveloped, what their personal persuasions are, etc., etc. In other words, if the Mormons want to have a city or a state in which there's no liquor and in which there's no sex and in which there's no fun, well, let them have such a state. If people in Nevada want to have gambling and evil Knievel and whatever else they want there, well, then let them have evil Knievel. Diversity characterizes a free or democratic society, not monotony or uniformity. Incidentally, that is one of the ways in which the homeland policy has actually produced relative diversity, and to that extent the homeland policy is entirely pro-democratic. It certainly brings about more choice. There are, obviously Sun Cities, blue movies, whatever, in Bophuthatswana, but even within Bophuthatswana there's not uniformity. In other words, in Sun City you can see a blue movie and see topless extravaganzas, but you can't see them in Mabatu, for example, or in Tabanshu, so that even within Bophuthatswana there's a tremendous diversity, which is the correct pro-democratic thing to do. And it's interesting that a homeland is the one that's done that. Then the other points are not particularly relevant to law, so I'm going to move on off that. Now the legal order that I propose for a future South Africa is firstly we have to deal with the following issues. How will the court system work? What protection of right, Mr. Adams, please note I put correctly, not rights, which might, maybe at some later stage we can explain the difference. The question of constitutions, to what extent do they make laws, prevent the making of laws, or the constitution. My own view is there should be lots of constitutions, not just one. Natural versus positive law, to what extent do we honor one or the other, or entrench one or the other, how laws are to be made, the conflict of laws and coordination. Now, the question here is that if, say, we go to Dennis Beckett's Maximal Democracy, and Melrose has a law in terms of which contracts of lease have to be in writing, and Rosebank has a law that says they can be verbal or oral. The question is, what happens if I, living in Melrose, enter into a rental agreement with Hertz Motor Car Company in Rosebank? And does that law, which law governs that contract? This is a very serious problem in law. Now you can imagine the absolute confusion. I mean, in law you have, for example, if a contract is entered into where a letter of acceptance is posted under one legal system and where it's received under another legal system, where then is the jurisdiction for the contract? Or, for example, if the law in Dobsonville says that there may be intergroup marriages and the law in Meadowlands says there may not, well, what happens to the couple if they travel through Meadowlands on their honeymoon? and so on. You can see that with a complexity of legal systems, a diversity of legal systems, a lot of conflicts, a lot of problems. You know, us lawyers have a lot of interesting things. In the South African law, prior to the removal of the Mixed Marriages Act in Section 16 of the Immorality Act, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Japanese people were defined as black, or at least non-white, and for purposes of sex and marriage, but were white for all other purposes. In other words, they were not subject to a special group area constraint or whatever. And lawyers used to describe the law as being that Japanese are white vertically and black horizontally. Now this is how sort of confusing and complex the law can get. But then there are a lot of other issues.
Leon, do you use the term natural law as being the same as common law?
Yes, it's not really. There are differences. In fact, no, I don't believe there is such a thing as natural law. In other words, natural law philosophers would hold that somehow out of nature comes law. I mean, I'm doing them an injustice because it's not that crude, obviously. But I don't think they think there is a law that applies regardless of humans. There's a sort of in nature, by virtue of the nature of human beings, there's a law. And that we can't make laws. Natural law just applies anyway, and statutes aren't really law at all. And you just comply with them because you don't want to go to jail. I don't think that's true. I think there's common law. That is law that emerges and is applied and differs from community to community. And in tribal areas, Zululand and KwaZulu and Transkei and so on, it can even differ from hillside to hillside. I mean, you can literally have in a village over here a set of common laws, for example, relating to how land is allocated or how marriages are contracted or lobola is paid. And right across the valley on the other side is another village in which there's another common law. These common laws tend to be procedurally different, but not substantively different, if you see the difference. In other words, that the law governs the same things. You may not commit rape, robbery, assault, force, fraud, etc. But what happens if somebody rapes somebody? What happens then? Do you send out a lynch mob? Or do you call them to trial, and do you have a jury, or don't you have a jury? And do you hang them if they're guilty, or do you fine them, or do you compensate the victim, or punish the criminal, or whatever? But everyone agrees there shouldn't be rape. So you see, natural law, I don't think the concept of natural law can't address such things as what procedures do you follow after a rape is committed? Or what are the formalities required for a contract to be concluded? Common law does address those things.
So natural law isn't really
No, I think that I used here, and I probably should have changed that, but for the time being, really what I'm saying is that on the one hand, there's a group of kindred spirits, the people who advocate natural law, common law, the rule of law, although there are technical differences between what each term means. For present purposes, I don't think they're important. I think we can use the words interchangeably or synonymously.
in actual fact, the common law, as you say, changes from village to village or from community to community, whereas natural law, in terms of what people who propagate natural law believe in, is that natural law is absolute and unchanging and never changes, is absolute.
Yeah, universally true. Yeah. You see, now someone like Hayek, who a lot of us here are followers of, just simply says that's gobbledygook. Usually you find the advocates of natural law resort to it out of, I think, and again, if there was some of them here, they obviously would attack me very severely, but out of a sort of intellectual laziness. It's a way of saying, my scheme of things is the natural law, that's why it's right. You sort of don't have to defend it, you don't have to justify each position you take. You say, there should be a just distribution of wealth. Why? Because it's the natural law. QED, you see. It's sort of up, you pick it from trees, or it falls from heaven at night, or something. It's a sort of in sloppiness, I think. And the point is, of course, everyone most people, and I mean a year ago I used to say that I believe in the natural law. Most people like to parade themselves as having miraculously somehow identified that in nature there is law, and they happen to know what this law is. But I think that really is a bit sort of mystical or whatever. It's a peculiar way to analyze laws. But let me immediately say there are very, very, Nobel Prize winning philosophers and jurists and professors and academics who are advocates of natural law, and they would come back and give a very compelling, sophisticated case for natural law, including one of my own great gurus, Murray Rothbard, who I think is one of the most profound thinkers of all time. He's a believer in natural law, and I've read what he has to say on it, and I'm not convinced. I think he's just very weak when it comes to law. He's good at everything else, but not at law. Well, what would the central government's position regarding law be? In my scheme of things, the central government will only be able to make laws or administer laws that are specifically delegated to it by the cantons. And this might be universal, as in Switzerland. You find that some laws have been handed holus bolus over to the federal government by all the cantons by treaty. But the central federal government of Switzerland does not have a single power to make law or administer law other than what has been delegated to it by the constituent cantons. At least, and even to the extent that it's in the Swiss constitution, that itself is of course a contract of delegation by the constituent cantons, not one of which had to sign it, and each one of which could have refused to do so. It will only then, and that sort of thing, for example, you might find that all of them delegate to the central government the right to control foreign trade, tariffs, for example, to issue money, a legal tender law. I mean, I would discourage them from making such a folly, but they probably will do it, and no amount of discouragement on my part will stop them. But that's the sort of thing you would expect them to give the central government as a power, that the central government will maintain a central bank or reserve bank and issue money, and it will decide, for example, on exchange rate policy or foreign exchange policy. Immigration, they will probably delegate deciding who may immigrate, or for that matter, who may emigrate. Contagious diseases, to say is the sort of thing, combating malaria, locust infestations, AIDS, whatever.
Sorry, Neil, what happens if, on tariffs, for example, if you cantons decide not to, then they will just opt out in that case? Is that possible in your scheme of things?
Yeah, I'm going to come around. What I think will have to happen eventually is that what the universal rights or position is, in other words, let us say all of them want tariffs to be a central government policy, and 5 years later a little radical libertarian canton decides it doesn't want tariffs. It seems to me then it has to exercise its right to secede from the federation, and that is probably the most contentious point in my model, because I think that each single constituent should be able to secede from the state, and if they don't secede they'll probably get kicked out anyway. I think there should be a mechanism whereby radical or discongruous or whatever incongruous units can secede. Now, politically this is important because you will probably find fairly radical left-wing pockets emerging, radical Marxist strongholds, Soweto, Alexandra, the Vaal Triangle or whatever, maybe. You will probably find fairly radical right-wing strongholds, Petersburg, Rustenburg, whatever. And it seems to me that one must probably accept ultimately that those strongholds might not be able to stay within the same state or federation or union or whatever together. I think they will be able to. I think that Switzerland has shown that you can tolerate socialist and laissez-faire cantons within one federation. But maybe, instead of the whole thing blowing apart in civil war, you need to accept that maybe a dozen cantons will secede and go off on their own, form an independent new state. And after all, I can't see on what account certainly the conservatives or right-wingers or the whites could object to that, because that's what the whole homeland policy was trying to do in the first place. And what claims to be, I mean, really the homeland policy, as government puts it, is that these black ethnic groups or states can choose independence, which is exercising, to put it in this language, the right of secession. So that's already sold there. The question is, can we sell it to others? And it seems to me the right to secede must be saleable.
I think perhaps it would be at this stage quite a good idea to think about the new canton that has been formed in Switzerland recently. And the new canton is a group of French-speaking people on the French border who traditionally were in the big canton of Bern with the German-speaking Swiss. And they were one of the richest cantons in Switzerland. And this new group of French-speaking, who were mostly Catholics, had decided that they wanted their own canton, and they are known as the Swiss Communists in Switzerland. They pushed through several referendums. They would never accept the fact that they lost one referendum. They pushed it through, they pushed it through, they pushed it through. Eventually, they got their independence. Now they are, it's not an economically viable state. So now they are asking for Bern to please help them out with more funds and all the rest of it. And this, I think, would be a problem that we would find here. If Petersburg were to decide to go its own way, they wouldn't be an economically viable proposition. I don't think they would manage. No matter, they may have valid ideas for going their own way, but I think the economics of the situation would be
Yeah, I thank you for that. I made some notes because that's an important point to research and mention specifically. The question of viability, incidentally, I don't personally attach much weight to that. I know that one tends to think that a place can be too small to be viable. But in fact, there are countries in the world, if one looks at the list of countries in terms of sizes, I had the figures here at the last talk, unfortunately. I don't have them now, when the constitutional model was being discussed. But there's something like 20 or 30 countries in the world with less than 500,000 people. And there's some with only a handful of people, like 20 or 30,000. And some of them are incredibly minute. Obvious example is Liechtenstein, which is, for all practical purposes, like a Swiss canton. And then places like Malta and Guernsey and any number of others. Lesotho right near us, Lesotho and Malawi are really very, very tiny. Southwest is about to become independent with something like 800,000 people. Which is huge geographically, but very, very tiny. So I don't think the tininess is so much of a problem. Just a response to the point of viability. The Vatican City is supposed technically an independent state, but no, that is. But I think you're quite right, though, that this would be Beckett's argument, is that the hard world of reality would actually get these constituents to behave in some kind of sensible, orderly way. And that's really, I think, also what you're saying, is in the end they'll have to come back to Bern and say, look, well, actually, we want to stay part of the big scheme of things. And I think, though, what is important to prevent racial, ethnic, geographical, religious, and other major conflict is for the option to be there. And then, a la Beckett, the option won't tend to get exercised. People will tend to want to be in on some kind of cooperative arrangement.
Just on your point of the delegated law, you're implying that there has to be universal agreement before a law is delegated. But of course, you could have a model that says 90%, 80%, 2/3 before it gets delegated.
Oh yes, sorry. No, you could. I should have put it in. That's why I forgot. Yes, no, that's true. You could have, for example, the Highveld cantons or the coastal cantons might, for example, delegate control over the beaches. Or the Highveld cantons might delegate control over aviation control, or whatever. No, that's true. You could have groups, pockets, arrangements. In other words, the relationship between central government and the constituent units of the federation or the state would be essentially contractual.
So now what I'm really saying is that before the central government could pass a law on tariffs, which may be universal to the whole of Southern Africa, it would have to have a percentage of the total cantons that agree with it, i.e. not 100% of the cantons, but if 80% of the cantons agree that the central government can pass laws on tariffs, then that would apply to the whole country.
No.
That's another
No. Yes, it is a possibility, but I'm against that. I think, in effect, every single canton should have the power of veto over what laws govern it. Otherwise, you're back to square one. You might as well have a unitary state. The whole point is that each canton has to be able to say no. The right to say no is crucial.
Sorry, I don't want to cut across you. Didn't you bring in defending the road under...
Yes, that's not a lawmaking function. So I'm only dealing with lawmaking here. Yes, no. The last time I dealt with the functions of central government, which were 5 departments, of which defence was one. This is really just the juridical or jurisprudence of the new South Africa.
Certainly have to be entrenched, though.
Yes, I would regard the central government is responsible for defence, would be one of its constitutional responsibilities, and trunk roads and contagious disease. Now, in regard to contagious disease, along with a number of others, these are just examples, it would need to make some kind of law, maybe, like vaccination, for example. But unless one is pro-conscription, which I'm not, I don't see that defence requires making laws. In fact, cantons might have conscription, and they might conscript people for the federal army, or they might have volunteer armies or professional armies or contributions. But each canton under the Constitution will be committed to make a proportional contribution towards defence. Now, whether that's in terms of manpower and or taxation is a detail to be negotiated at the constitutional debate. But all I'm talking about here is lawmaking, legislative functions. And the central government will have, what's important to note here, is not one of the central government lawmaking functions is potentially ethnically conflict provoking. In other words, there will be nothing that the central government can legislate that is a threat to peace. You might think that the immigration policy is a bad one. They should let in more engineers or less engineers. Or you might think that the tariff barriers are too high or low, but those are not of a politicizing, conflict-provoking nature, essentially. That is why this approach, I think in Beckett, Lombard, in my opinion, is the solution to our political problem. Those are non-political powers that tend not to be a source of conflict. In other words, I don't think that Bishop Tutu's view on tariffs is particularly different from PW's view on tariffs. I think they could easily sit around the same cabinet room and discuss the tariff policy or the malaria policy or whatever. Those are not the issues that cause difference.
What about passports?
Yes, that would be an immigration thing. You mean if the federal government doesn't give Bishop Tutu a passport, what then?
Yes. So I don't like the head of some commie state going overseas and talking.
No, that's a good question. Maybe one has to have as an entrenched right. Well, you see, it is already, incidentally, an entrenched right to leave the country on a one-way passport. But the problem is if you want to come in again, they can say to you, you can go provided you don't return. That's really the problem. Graham, you looking?
Yes, they're only suggesting that once these states have delegated to the central government the right to create laws, say on immigration, contagious disease, that from then on, the states themselves lose any right of veto, because the two issues are there. The one is they continue to control, for example, contagious disease. Let's say they all agree to delegate this right to make laws on contagious diseases, but then 2 or 3 states say, wait a minute, we don't like those laws. We'd either remove your right to create this law first. It's obviously not important enough issue to secede over contagious disease, but they still don't want to be governed by that particular law, let's say. Or immigration, for example. Maybe some of the more conservative states say, hang on a minute, we don't want this flow of Malawians into the country anymore because they're coming into our territory. We've got to have this freedom of mobility. Stop it, or we veto that.
I think the real world is that Switzerland, the USA, and other federations have not thrown that sort of thing up as one of the problems, at least not to my knowledge.
They're heterogeneous.
No, they are heterogeneous, yes.
Yes, Switzerland, they are. I mean, Switzerland, they all decide, doesn't matter what canton, that they're not going to have the Spaniards and the Italians becoming Swiss. They can come and work there on work permits for so many years, but after that they go back home.
Sorry, did you mean that?
On an immigration policy, they all seem to agree on the point that they don't want a lot of outside immigrants settling in their country.
Well, actually, the vote went. They did have a referendum on that, and they voted in favour of the Gastarbeiters. But no, I think it's the other way around. What is? Sorry.
Would it depend on the canton?
What happens in Switzerland is that the delegated powers are then decided at central government, and the minority lose out. Because what happened in Switzerland is that some of the cantons, I think the Italians, who were a very small minority, are the biggest opponents of Gastarbeiters. But they have just simply been overruled each time. And the other one was, I mean, it doesn't sound very contentious, but seatbelts. The Germans were in favour of seatbelts, and the French, Italians, and Romanos were against seatbelts. And the decision went against seatbelts, and the Germans are 60%. So the majority lost out there. So in other words, what happens, and that seems to be correct, is that where the function is delegated, the lawmaking function, the canton lives with that. It agrees that for practical purposes we are going to surrender such and such a function, and we're going to live with the results, and that's how they actually do it in both the USA and Switzerland.
The chances are that you might find that immigration does not become the kind of law that central government
Maybe not. Maybe each canton will want to maintain some kind of influx control.
And then you have this mobility of labour falling by the wayside or becoming less.
Oh no, but not of citizens. No.
Yeah.
If some canton says we are not going to allow non-citizens in, then that's probably something that it will be an autonomous power. Eustace?
Always subject to the right to call for a referendum on an issue.
Yes. Sorry, that's absolutely quite right. That's how Switzerland does it with things like Gastarbeiters. It's a federal government power, but when it was clear that there was a division, they have a national referendum, and the whole lot vote, one man, one vote, and they voted by quite a narrow margin in favour of Gastarbeiters. And it looks as if the support for that is declining. In other words, 5 or 6 years' time you might have the vote going the other way. But what they also have voted against is giving them citizenship. Now that's a real problem they have, as we have, which is the 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation descendant of some guest worker from abroad of another nationality and culture. He says, but I was born in Switzerland. And they haven't resolved that yet. That's a potentially very awkward problem the Germans and the Swiss still have to face. There are now 2nd generation Gastarbeiters who are claiming citizenship. And in Switzerland, the Gastarbeiters are, I don't know the exact figure, but I think it's somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population. So it's more than there are Italians, who constitute one of the official languages. Okay, then I think that there need to be certain universal rights, or a Bill of Rights. How these rights would be entrenched, I think, is in the central government constitution with an independent judiciary at central government level. There will be free movement of people and wealth throughout the country, throughout the federation, whatever one wants to call it. That I believe, I think Lombard, Beckett and I all agreed that the freedom of movement is actually the key, the magic in the formula. That it will prevent Zappa-dominated cantons from being Marxist simply because people will vote against them with their feet. It will enable certain cantons to be highly conservative. I mean, for example, Rustenburg might maintain separate amenities, whether they're provided privately, which would be my preference. In other words, people would be allowed to have privately provided separate schools, swimming pools, theatres, whatever, that say no blacks allowed, whites only, Jews only, tall people only, ugly people only, whatever they jolly well like is their affair, but racially will be the main, the sensitive question, and then people will be able to migrate to and concentrate themselves in cantons that correspond to their own persuasion. Beckett is, for example, in favour of allowing fully fledged Verwoerding or weerstandsbeweging apartheid to flourish. I mean, for example, people can establish the canton of Oranje, or the one I had, Afrikaner, the book that I had here at one of the talks, and they would just say no blacks, or only blacks as migrants, and no intermarriage, no whatever. Lombard and my problem with that view, Beckett thinks that major concessions have to be made to white racist convictions or black racist convictions. Lombard and I have the problem as to whether we can achieve peace within that. I think philosophically it's correct. If we were sitting here 20 years ago, we could probably have designed a South Africa in which that was saleable internally and internationally, that you would have pockets of rigid segregation, statutory segregation. My problem now is the horse is bolted from the stable door. It's probably an option which is no longer available in the real political world, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's pro-democratic to enable societies, provided they don't impose their will on others, to indulge whatever prejudices they have, including as a Jewish fellow, they might have a Nazi canton. It says no Jews. And however offensive you might find that, there was a time when that might have been accepted as a legitimate form of prejudice, provided they do it in their own area and to themselves, that they can't impose it on people outside of their jurisdiction. Lombard and I are of the view that that's a lost opportunity, that the mood of opinion in the world is now so hostile that can't be resurrected and can't be salvaged. In other words, the mood of opinion is now so anti-discrimination that even where discrimination does not constitute a rights violation, people will no longer tolerate it. And people will say apartheid is still there. And whoever, the West, the United Nations, black nationalists are racists. But that happens currently to be acceptable. In other words, you can have an Africanization policy in Tanzania which discriminates in favor of blacks, but you cannot in the modern world have a policy that discriminates against blacks. You can discriminate against whites, as does affirmative action.
I think we could have states here that were purely black or didn't allow whites to rule persons.
Yes, in fact, virtually everyone...
That's acceptable. Well,
that's acceptable. I mean, whether it's right, well, I think it is right, but it's popularly acceptable. I mean, Ian is very involved with NAFCOC. The overwhelming opinion amongst blacks is there needs to be a period, for however long, in which whites are not allowed to go and trade and do business in black areas. Now, as far as I know, there are very, very few blacks who feel uncomfortable about that. They just say, well, you know, it's to redress past injustices and so on and so forth. I think there would need to be a certain protection of civil liberties, a sort of standard Bill of Rights approach, habeas corpus, have the corpse, it means really. It means have the body, to be precise. but you know, the right to appear before court. For example, if there is detention without trial, it seems to me that I think you could easily design a system of law in which you can achieve the intended objectives of detention without trial in terms of security needs without having it. In other words, describe the law so that everybody can be tried. But the mandate to the judiciary is somewhat differently described. And that seems to me relatively easy. I mean, I could write such a law for South Africa right now, and they could have all the people that are now detained could be detained, and they would have had a trial. But more importantly, it seems to me that you should have other things, like that people who have not been convicted of actual crimes have civilian conditions of detention. They have comfortable living quarters with television and access to the media and liberal access to friends and relatives and medical practitioners and lawyers and so on. In other words, it seems to me that even the detention laws could be written so that it's not really all that much of an imposition. It's like being, you know, at the Rustenburg Spa or whatever for the period of your detention. A jacuzzi and a gym and...
How would you cope with the people who, when finding themselves out of work, just arrange to have themselves put in detention?
Well, that happens now. I mean, it's.
But if you make the detention more comfortable, then you have more of that happening.
In my scheme of... well, I wonder. You might have somebody who... But won't you actually detect those? You know, I mean, if you're out of work and you stand up and say, I think we should bomb Parliament tomorrow. I mean, are you really going to persuade anyone that you're a serious security risk? I think you'd need to go a little bit further, in which case the chances are you'll actually get locked up for good, and then you'd be sailing close to the wind if you try to get yourself detained, but not actually charged and sentenced. And that's a kind of problem that I'm comfortable with facing if ever it arises. I'm not aware of it ever having happened. But what does happen now, of course, is with pass control, pass laws, is that unemployed blacks are reputed to actively try to get themselves arrested because it's the only way they can get a square meal and a comfortable bed and a roof over their heads. And I mean, quite obviously, the conditions even in a South African prison or a normal prison are more comfortable than the conditions under a bridge or on a park bench or whatever. So there's a lot to be said. And the South African police, to their credit, by the way, I think do take in people anyway who want to spend the night.
So do the hospitals, I believe.
Yes, and I think, you know, one could have havens of shelter, which I think should be run by private charities anyway. Incidentally, it is interesting throughout the world how many people choose to be vagrants when there is a lavish provision of social amenities at their disposal. Things like St. John's Ambulance hostels and stuff, and especially in Europe, where the bag women of Park Avenue, I mean, notorious in New York, hundreds of people who go around groveling in the rubbish bins. In Washington, in the park stretching down ahead in front of the Congress. You have these hobos and bums and dropouts, the bag women, they're all over London and so on, and all of them can just walk into an institution and be cared for, but they choose not to. It's a chosen way of life. And that, incidentally, is one of the things that, it's an interesting question. I once wrote a short article on why begging and bumming is illegal in communist countries. It's actually a very interesting curtailment of personal freedom that you get in communist countries, that people are not allowed to be beggars or not allowed to be hobos. And one of the unpleasant things about a free society is you do have these smelly souls sort of lying around on the park benches. You know, one must make that choice, I'm afraid. I would say that you want a central government constitution that forbids a discriminatory law. This will be the most difficult and most contentious one to sell. But statutory discrimination, I think, should be illegal under the Constitution. There should be equality at law for all people. But equally, there must be freedom of association and disassociation, which includes a statutory right to discriminate on the grounds of race. There's a major difference of concept here. Voluntary racial discrimination seems to me to be necessarily one of the most fundamental human rights. People must be able to say, I hate blacks, or I refuse to deal with Indians, or I will not allow Jews into my cinema, or this is an Afrikaners only township which I'm proclaiming here, or only people who pledge themselves to be Christians can buy in my new Christian village township. And that can be governed entirely by contract, entirely voluntarily. And you know, it's interesting that we have such a raging debate in South Africa, or such a major production is made out of whether we should scrap the group area laws and the influx control laws summarily and so on. Right within our own effective political borders, this was done in a number of places. Southwest Africa, overnight, abolished the group area legislation and influx control legislation, and there were no consequences of any note. Now, some 5, 6, 7 years later, there are reports of 1 or 2 black doctors or dentists or lawyers have moved into white areas, but hardly anyone knows of any. It's actually very hard to find. The spontaneous separation of the races has gone on as before. Katatura outside Windhoek remains the Soweto of Windhoek. The white areas, including the lower income white areas, remain almost exclusively white. Middle class and even upper middle class black residential areas with freehold title have started emerging. There was no influx problem, despite massive unemployment in Avambaland, and despite worse still the militarization of Avambaland. You would expect people to be driven out, never mind in search of the bright lights, jobs, but in search of safety of body and limb. Hasn't happened. The same has happened in the 4 independent homelands, Venda, Bophuthatswana, Transkei and Ciskei. No influx control, no group area laws, nothing has changed. So it seems to me that voluntary birds of association, birds of a feather flock together, including, I would go even further, as I said, the right of somebody to establish a township which is proclaimed and according to the title deed is a whites-only township, or a blacks-only, Indians-only, whatever they jolly well like. And that, I think, if South Africa could gain the moral ground in the world, we could easily, in a relatively easy step from where we are, get into a position when we can say to the rest of the world, we are the only truly free society in the world. We are the only society in which voluntary association and contract is constitutionally entrenched. In every other country, people are forced to integrate against their will, which is clearly anti-democratic and anti-personal rights. And we are one very easy step away from turning the moral tables on the world, and from being the polecat of the world, we can become the self-righteous moralists of the world, pointing to the human rights violations in the USA under busing and quota laws and throughout Europe, and the human rights violations in Germany and Switzerland, where 2nd and 3rd generation Gastarbeiters are denied citizenship, and so on. It's actually surprisingly close for us, with very little change to our real world experience.
But the leftists, their tactic would be to ignore this completely. In fact, they would write articles about that, yes, so many clubs in Johannesburg have been started, the doors are closed to blacks, or the doors are closed to so and so and so and so and so. And obviously, they would say the conclusion is that that is a racist society.
Well, you know, at the moment we can't respond to that. At the moment, our hands are tied.
Yes.
We can be hammered, maligned, criticized, insulted. But under a system in which there is a statutory prohibition of discriminatory law, but a statutory right of voluntary association, we can say, yes, that is so. That is their right. It is not being done with taxes. It is not being done by the state. It is being done at their expense by their free choice. And I would gladly engage anybody in such a debate, and I would expect to win. I think there are few people who would reject such an argument.
I think you would win, sorry.
I would say that this would be a very important point to put in your book for the Americans, because it's very relevant to the American society today. The Americans have had integration forced upon them, and they're suffering from the results of having been forced to bus it to schools to do all this sort of thing. But of course, you're going to get a heck of a reaction from the Democrats, the media in general, because I think that they would find out something which would demolish the present order.
Yes, one would get a reaction, but a perplexed reaction. I mean, I've actually had this experience on American TV, where I was in a debate with a moderator, and the person opposed to me was a black fellow, and I said to him, why, it wasn't quite this context, I said to him, why are you a racist? He was wanting to talk to me about South Africa, you see, so I was supposedly going to defend the South African system, and I just said, why are you so racist? He said, what do you mean racist? I'm against racism. So I said, well, you're very flattering to white South Africans. He said, why? I said, because you presume in your singling South Africa out for attack that whites should, by virtue of their skin color, observe more civilized principles of government. You expect whites to govern in a civilized manner, but you don't expect blacks to govern in a civilized manner. In other words, when black governments violate the rights of blacks, they do not attract the kind of condemnation that South Africa does when a white government violates the rights of blacks. Even less than the black governments violate their rights, for example, Samora Machel or whatever. Now that seems to me to be a very racist, anti-black view. The assumption that blacks, by virtue of their skin color, are not expected to govern properly anyway. You only expect civilized government from whites. Anyway, the rest of the debate was all about why he's a racist, and we never spoke about South Africa. But they actually don't know how to handle it when you turn the tables on them.
Yes, that's right.
And that's actually the strongest thing, is when you can come back at them and point out the immorality, anti-democraticness, anti-human rights position of their own civil rights and affirmative action laws. I mean, racial quotas, diabolical racist law. So I don't have any fear of that, and I actually think that you will... one must remember there was a time in the world when that kind of voluntary discrimination never had any connotations. It doesn't even today in certain contexts. In other words, the Dutch Club of Johannesburg, nobody says they're discriminators or racists or whatever. Dr. Motlana's ex-wife Sally runs the Black Housewives League. It allows only black women, discriminates against whites and men on the grounds of gender and skin color. Nobody minds. People accept that. It is true that there will be an incident here and there where some white restaurant owner doesn't want to allow blacks in, or some black restaurant owner doesn't want to allow whites in. I went to a nightclub in the Reeperbahn of Germany called Top 10. And if any of you are ever in Hamburg, in Germany, go to the Top 10 nightclub and try and walk in, and you will find that some big burly black bouncers meet you at the door and say, no whiteys allowed, and kick you out in the middle of Germany. It's a blacks only nightclub. And I presume it is in fact illegal, but it works, and I don't think anyone minds. I mean, I said, oh, well, I don't want to go into a blacks-only nightclub anyway. It suited me, you know, it was nice of them to tell me before I had to find out inside I was in the wrong place. So I left. I mean, it actually suits people to have these spontaneous ethnic arrangements. And of course, they're women only. There's 3 or 4 lesbian nightclubs. I mean, over here, they have women-only nights. I don't know what happens there. I've often thought that they'd be a lot better off if they let me in. But they don't, for whatever reason. You see, these kinds of separation don't cause offence. It's only when they're statutory that they seem to cause offence. For example, one last example is, I don't know how many of you have ever really been into deep Harlem and deep Bronx. But very few whites ever do that, and again it's something I'd recommend to you. I was taken into deep Harlem and Bronx by a woman who was the first black woman stockbroker in America. And she said that there are very few white Americans who know anything about black areas. We went in there, we were there from about 6 a.m. We had breakfast in a soul food restaurant. We left after lunch, and we saw one other white person who was a woman with a man, and the presumption was that the white woman was a prostitute. She said everyone would have assumed that she was a prostitute and I was her customer, and that was the only reason why any two people of a different race are expected to be seen together in deep Harlem. The degree of group area segregation is as rigid as anything ever dreamt of in South Africa. But it's voluntary, it's spontaneous, and therefore non-offensive. And if you try to go into a nightclub in Harlem, you would simply not be allowed in. And no amount of affirmative action or civil rights laws in America can stop it, and everyone accepts that it is their right and their freedom, and they should be allowed to. And we would actually entrench that as a constitutional right, is for blacks to keep non-blacks out of Harlem, or Chinese to keep non-Chinese out of Chinatown. In the USA, the American government is trying to force the Chinese to integrate. They're an extremely segregated, highly ethnically conscious community, and in the Chinatowns of the major American cities there are no non-Chinese people at all. Street signs are in Chinese, the newspaper is in Chinese, and the only people who ever go there are people who go and have Chinese food in the Chinese restaurants, and then they leave again. And we would actually recognize that as a legitimate form of human behavior, whereas in the modern crazy Western world, partly a reaction to apartheid, we've partly brought it upon ourselves. It's because apartheid has made ethnic consciousness so offensive. Obviously Hitler also made it offensive, but we particularly in the modern world have made it offensive, that the whole might of the state is now being brought down upon people who have ethnic consciousness in a perfectly voluntary, harmless way. And we need to reverse that.
I think this is about taking that to the groups, I don't know what everything on this thing, is that all these stable ethnic group communities have one thing in common as an acceptable income. In other words, income grading to observers is particular Japanese villages where I can get data. That's like, and this seems to happen. You've got to have that income grading to hold people together. Comes in intact, black, white, any description, but that must be there.
Right. Now I have your, well, I don't know if there's more that you've brought out since I last got your stuff, but I have your material. Yeah. Now I agree with you. Your material is very, I think, correct and useful, except I think you tend to impute cause and effect the reverse of the way I would do it. In other words, I think the optimum income gradient is a consequence of the right legal and economic order, rather than a cause of the right legal and economic order. Okay. Well, we can maybe discuss that separately, but I think it'll get a bit technical, perhaps here.
But while we're on the subject, I think it wouldn't be out of context to think about ethnicity. You were talking about ethnicity, that is the fact that you don't quite agree with the ethnicity if we were going to have separate states. Because I think ethnicity is something that the colonialists cut across all that, you know, when they made up their borders in Malawi and in Tanganyika and all this sort of thing. But in actual fact, the African tribes have hung together somehow or other and still have a quite strong relationship across geographical borders. And I think that here in South Africa, if we were to divide up, I think that ethnicity should be taken into consideration. I think that you would find the tribes happier in their own groupings, in their own ethnic.
No, I agree with that. That I said was one of the differences between Lombard, Beckett and myself. Lombard would like to have centrally divided, if you like, as far as I know, similar to a sort of extension, if you like, of the apartheid system on a grander scale.
Yes.
Beckett says no account to be taken of ethnicity. And I say ethnicity may or may not be a consideration. We can't say in advance. In other words, ethnicity is, to my mind, admissible evidence in favor of a particular geographic arrangement. So you might find, for example, a bunch of Zulus who go over the escarpment, but it might not. It might be more persuasive to draw the boundary along the escarpment.
Yes.
So ethnicity wouldn't be
Yes.
a dominant.
They would still relate. They would still relate. To,
Yes.
To, even if they were in a different geographical area, they still would relate.
Yes. In other words, to my mind, you do not prescribe in any way to the Judicial Delimitation Commission that will decide on the boundaries. It has an absolute open discretion, and whatever evidence is led is weighed up by it as courts weigh up evidence as objectively as they can. And I believe, predictably, obviously, Soweto, there would be a very, very strong case for Soweto to be a self-contained canton on ethnic grounds. But there would be less of a case, for example, for Arnslate, in the middle of nowhere, which has 10 whites and 15 blacks, to be 2 cantons. You would say, no, look, this is really more of a geographic issue. Ethnicity here can't be the dominant factor. So I don't think you can decide in advance what role and what relevance and what weighting ethnicity has to have. I think that's got to be a matter of evidence as time goes by. It's got to be an open question. Sorry, Duncan.
Back to your other diagram, please. Your universal rights.
Yeah.
Just like to add one little thing to that, and that is that the rights cannot exist without the general acceptance of the corresponding duties. That one could make it clear that the rights are by general acceptance of the corresponding duties, which then do become duties.
Yes, in law, for what it's worth, sorry.
This will transfer a lot of things which presently are looked upon as being the government's duty back to the population. If it is a duty of mine to see that you're not beaten up in the street if I have to be around, then it doesn't mean that everybody stands back, as I've seen them doing in Joburg on a Saturday afternoon. 20 people standing around while one man's kicking another one to death. It is their duty to stop that fight.
I'm not sure if that's a duty that I'd agree should be a statutory duty. Whether it's a moral duty or a social duty is another matter. But in law, all rights have a corresponding duty.
Unfortunately, the emphasis is put on rights, and everybody says, "Give me my rights," and nobody's saying, "Oh."
The reason why, I mean, maybe this is a thing that gets lost, and I certainly, in view of what you say, will expand on it. But certainly, in the free society paradigm, the reason why there's so much talk of rights is because the right is the positive statement. The duty tends to be a negative statement. In other words, you may not assault, you may not breach agreements, you may not commit acts of decency or insult or whatever. And I think just generally one prefers describing your position by what you're in favor of rather than what you're against. The duty tends to be a negative statement.
Just looking at what has happened in the world over the last 2 centuries, it would appear that a lot of the problems, particularly in the third world, have been directly as a result of the Bill of Human Rights, where they say, we have got rights, where are our rights? They're demanding. And this has cut across the natural duties that used to exist. They exist, the tribal duties that existed. There was a natural law. Every man in a village would correct a youngster if he's trying to do something wrong?
I think, Mr. Dunkley, the question is, it is true. I mean, if you look, for example, the kinds of things I had on my Free Society side, benevolence and charity, the issue you raised about the family, the extended family, the community ethic, and all of these things. One of the reasons why I'm against an interventionist welfare socialist state is because it converts moral duties, virtues, into crimes. Or alternatively, the state takes over the moral behavior. The state becomes the provider of welfare, for which it needs first to plunder. It can't do one without the other. Before the state can do good, it has to do bad. Whereas when on the Free Society paradigm, good is good per se, no bad needs to precede it. Now, I think one of the problems is the society you speak of is the society which I would argue is a consequence of freedom. And the duty is not a statutorily imposed duty. In other words, you're not obliged against criminal sanction to be a good citizen and support the local charity. It's a moral duty. There's a lot of social pressure, moral, religious, ethnic, whatever pressure on you.
At the time that the Bill of Rights the American Bill of Rights was drafted, it was clearly understood that rights and duties were one and the same. The one could not exist without the other. But unfortunately, it would appear that many people are forced to do it, and they're thinking particularly in the third world nations, and they demand rights without any acceptance of the corresponding duty.
Terry's showing me his watch.
I don't know how much longer you still got to go on your side.
Well, it's not much longer. It's nearly finished. Maybe I should just finish quickly. We have really run out of time, but there's been more discussion during the session than usual.
I think, sorry, on Godfrey's point, I think it's a matter of degree, and maybe you could clarify it afterwards as to where the rights, how far the rights go down.
I think also maybe the word I would prefer to use is responsibilities, because duties implies crime. And that's what I want to get away from, is a decriminalization of society. But along with it comes personal responsibility, freedom and responsibility. Sorry.
I think that's what the gentleman might be referring to more accurately is how do you impose a system which you are envisaging of one set of values, which one might call a libertarian set of values, on a heterogeneous society where you have got differing types of value systems in operation. And that for me would be a critical issue with what you are formulating here. Could it work in those terms?
Yes. What Lombard, Beckett and I all say, and Beckett is very emphatic about this, I mean more so than the rest of us, is that it actually requires a development of a new consciousness, value system, political ethic, social ethic. All three of us are of the view, and I think most people in South Africa are now of the view, that the community consciousness is in such ferment that it can in fact adjust to something new quite rapidly and quickly. And so yes, the answer is that it would require a lot of propaganda, a lot of persuasion, a lot of central government conviction, which is why, incidentally, all three of us are against forming a new political party. We think you have to get the current political order mobilized.
Two words which are missing from the educational training when you're trying to remove people rapidly through value systems to the new order.
Yeah.
What I suggest we do is, can we let Leon finish this, because there may be one or two people who want to hear that can go home early, and those, if Leon's prepared to stick around for another half an hour, can carry on with the general discussion. Is that okay, John?
Yes, okay, let me move quickly. Freedom of contract I've crossed out with lots of question marks because although I would argue for and will press for a constitutional right for people to enter into whatever contracts they like, subject perhaps reluctantly to the prescribing of the form of the contract. For example, a thing like the Credit Agreements Act says what must be in your agreement, but the substance of the agreement is up to negotiation. The reason I cross it out is because it's probably unsaleable. I mean, most people, it would be a tremendous educational task to get people to accept real freedom of contract in the society. So it's something that I don't think has to really be fought for. Freedom of contract, I think particularly Beckett and I are of the view, will be fairly adequately preserved by the process of political competition or the demonstration effect between different systems. The court system would need to be independent. I won't go into what that means in law. It's actually quite a complex thing. It's actually very difficult to have a truly independent court. I would say that an essential part of it has to be real people's courts, that is to say, easy, cheap, quick access to the law. The main problem in society is that the law is inaccessible to people. It's too costly, it's slow, and it can't be reached. So the law is effectively only accessible to very, very poor people who get legal aid and very, very rich people who can afford it, but the vast majority of people have no effective access to the judiciary. They cannot get their rights protected. So you need a real efficient rights system. It might well, South Africa is, by the way, well on the way with the new small claims court towards that. That has to be extended to be able to not only govern small claims but all sorts of legal rights and duties. Appeal, one of my federal central government functions would be an appeal court, which would be something like the Privy Council, in that it will be a court which applies different laws. That is to say, when an appeal comes from one of the cantons, it might be under that canton's own legal system, and that we have already anyway with our appeal court, because it's the appeal court for all the TBVC RSA countries, and all of them have different laws, and when appeals go from those countries to the appeal court, it has to apply a different law. So you would have a central government-controlled independent judiciary, which is again like the Swiss have. I would introduce the idea of class action, which is unfortunately alien to the Roman Dutch and the Anglo-Saxon common law, which we have, but is part of the American law. The Ciskei is about to get class actions, incidentally, and Roger van Niekerk and I are going down there tomorrow to explain the whole system to their magistrates, their prosecutors, and their lawyers, their departmental officials, and it's the first introduction of the concept to South Africa. What it really means is that people do not have to have locus standi, which means you do not yourself have to be an injured person or a defendant in order to bring an action. You can bring an action against somebody who's committing fraud or selling unsafe food or whatever. Third persons can bring actions in the public interest. Then lawmaking, I would have a system of referendum that all laws in the cantons or at central government level, as in Switzerland, against obtaining of a certain minimum number of signatures, can be subjected to referendum. It turns out that people, when they do have referendums for laws rather than politicians, tend to vote no, which is why I have such a faith in people. They actually don't want the laws they get. People do not want shop hour laws. They do not want restrictive taxi laws. They do not want zoning laws, but they get them. And the democratic voting procedure has been shown over and over again in public opinion surveys to produce laws that people don't want, so that you would have a system of voting for the law, the policy, rather than the person, or in addition to the person. Regulations would only be administrative by nature, part of administrative law, on which I say a little in a moment. There would be, I think, it would be feasible to require every single law to have what's called a sunset clause. That is to say, when the law is passed, it must state in the law for how long the law applies. It has an automatic termination date, and it could say 20 years. But at the time laws are proposed, the legislators tell us repeatedly that it's to deal with a certain set of conditions. They must decide with probably a maximum period, maybe 20 years or 50 years or whatever. We said a maximum, I haven't thought that through, but a built-in self-destruction in the law when it terminates, at which time it can be re-legislated if they like. But the law has to have a lifespan. It can't last forever.
There's an easier way. Instead of putting a year limitation on it or a couple of years limitation on it, you just say a fixed number of laws apply. If you bring in one law, you're going to take one out. You decide which one.
I like that. I like that. I'm going to make a note of that in a moment. Then, as I said, that that cantons that really do want to depart from this scheme of things would need to secede. And I would have a secession clause in the central constitution. And then quickly I'll go through this. I've dealt with the problem of conflict and jurisdiction. It's quite well settled in common law. We wouldn't really need to legislate on it. Administrative law, the laws would have to be objective and not discretionary, like, for example, the licensing laws. The particular I mentioned in earlier sessions, some of you will recall, I won't go into again in detail, but the real problem with South Africa, in my opinion, is not the group area laws or the segregation laws, but the fact that in black areas the law is discretionary and in white areas the law is objective. If blacks in black areas had always had objective law, exactly the same as whites in white areas, I think apartheid would probably be fairly acceptable in the world today. Soweto would be a bustling city with a CBD, with theatres and shops, and it would be just like Johannesburg. The reason why apartheid is regarded as discriminating against blacks and not against whites is because the law in white areas is a preferred law. The law says, I may not live in Soweto. Now, no one in the world says that this is a gross invasion of Leon Louw's freedom. Why not? Because although people haven't articulated it as clearly as I have, the reason is because everyone knows that the law in Houghton or Melrose or Rosebank or whatever is a preferred law to the law in Soweto. It's not the separateness which is the unacceptability of the thing. It's the difference which is the unacceptability. And I propose the principle of equivalence, which is a term I've invented and which I'm sure you're going to hear much about next year, because I expect certain measures and legislation to bring about the idea of equivalence, is that the position must be equivalent in different group areas. There must be public hearings where they, under administrative law, and reasons have to be given for public decisions. In other words, if a license is refused, you're entitled publicly to know the reasons for rulings. For example, the transport boards do not grant road haulage permits to blacks, although the Act that doesn't permit them to discriminate on the grounds of colour. They would have to give reasons. Why are there no black road haulage permits in South Africa? That would be something they would be called upon to explain. And they could say, look, we haven't had any applicants, or the only ones who've only had a truck with 3 wheels, or whatever. But they might well have reasons. Inter-canton law, there's a problem in jurisprudence relating to precedent. The law, I would say, in the Constitution should be persuasive. In other words, interpretations of the courts in one canton would not necessarily bind the courts in another canton. In South Africa at the moment, the interpretations of the Supreme Court in Natal bind the Supreme Court in the Transvaal, for example. It seems to me that part of devolution is you have to break the rigid system of precedent so that the law is only persuasive. There would be an onus on the state to make its case. You would not place the onus on the accused or the civilian. In other words, if I apply for a permit or a license or a zoning alteration to my house or whatever, and the state and I are in conflict, there must be a legal presumption in my favour which can be rebutted by the state. A pro-citizen law instead of a pro-state law. The cantons would have autonomy. There would be a demonstration effect and freedom of migration, points which I've covered. And that brings me to my conclusion. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the sixth talk in the series. This afternoon, Leon will be talking about the economic order. Somebody pointed out to me just now that when one talks about the current conditions in South Africa, it should perhaps be the economic disorder. But of course, what Leon is going to sketch is what it should be and not what it is at the moment. I'd like to remind you that the final talk, which was to have taken place on Monday, the 28th of October, has been moved back to the Thursday, the 24th of October. Please note that. Leon has been asked participate in a disinvestment seminar in the United States, and will be leaving that weekend after the 24th. And without further ado, I think I'll hand you over to Leon. As far as the disclaimer is concerned, I think you've all heard that Leon is speaking for himself. I personally agree with everything he says, but we just have to go through the ritual. Thank you.
Thanks. You don't need to applaud. The session today on the economic order, I believe, is the most important. My own view is, along with Karl Marx, it's about the only thing I have in common with him, is that economics is a more important determinant in the course of events than anything else. And that all the other manifestations, all the other things we talk about, politics, social questions, racial questions, unrest and what have you, tend to be consequences of or flow from or determined by economic issues. The curious thing about this is that you wouldn't guess so when you read the media. The media seems to think that what politicians say and think is more important than economics. They seem to think that what business people say about politics is more important than what business people say or do about business. And they seem to, the media seems generally to, in my opinion, as I say, along with Karl Marx and Adam Smith, so I'm in good company, overlook the real underlying questions. I sometimes am very cynical when, for example, giving evidence to someone like the President's Council. I made the point to the Economic Affairs Committee inquiring into aspects of economic policy that I wager, perhaps a few hundred rand I'd wager, that every single person who gives evidence to them will give evidence that happens fortuitously by apparent divine coincidence to coincide precisely with their self-interest. In other words, if Pick and Pay gives evidence in favor of a certain control over shop hours, it will just by absolute chance, I mean it's not self-interest or not greed or whatever, it's just by chance, will coincide with what happens to suit Pick and Pay. If somebody gives evidence in favor of a certain minimum standard regulation, or if Old Mutual gives evidence in favor of a certain interest rate policy, or somebody else gives, an industrialist gives evidence in favor of a certain tariff policy, or whatever. Whoever gives evidence, I said, I predict, and I'm willing to wager a sizable sum of money for me, that is, that it will always, by sheer coincidence, it seems, coincide precisely with their self-interest. That, I said, I will also wager will never be disclosed as being in their self-interest. Not one of them will say that because it's good for my company or my business, or because it gives me a competitive advantage, we believe you should have the following influx control policy, or the following labor policy, or the following minimum standards policy, or the following licensing policy, or whatever. Everyone will parade themselves as advocating whatever they advocate as it being in favor of the public interest, or the national interest, or the common good, or whatever. So it seems that virtually everybody goes around holding forth a whole bunch of things, whether they're malicious or calculating, or whether it just happens to be the brief they get from the investors or whatever, I don't know. But people go around playing this incredible charade, this wonderful game, where everybody pretends and everybody treats it seriously. We all take it solemnly. When some new issue happens, you have a list of faces on SABC TV, or after the budget you have 20 people, so-and-so from Chamber of Industries and Commerce and such a business person and so on, all giving one-liner comments. Now, I could actually save the media lots of money. I could write them all for them. And I might not have the impissima verba, I might not have the grammar quite right, or the style quite right, but the substance I'll get right every single time. I could give all the evidence that was received by any commission of inquiry. I could write for them because it is so boringly predictable, which every single person is going to say who gives evidence. And yet we all continue this sort of incredible charade, this game, sort of medieval farce, as if this is not really what's happening. You know, the minister would often say, for example, it's not the government that wants such and such an intervention, it's the private sector. We were asked by the estate agents to pass the Estate Agents Act. So don't blame us. The private sector wants the Estate Agents Act, or the whatever act, you name it, Ladovka, it doesn't matter, any act. In fact, I'm going to mention them at a later stage, Louw's 11 laws of intervention. And one of Louw's 11 laws of intervention is behind every single intervention there is a vested interest that benefits from that intervention at the expense of the general public. In fact, most interest groups are a sort of conspiracy against the public interest. My own profession, for example, lawyers, will put up the most persuasive case for why you can't allow champagny and touting and advertising and discounting of lawyers' fees, and why you need the strictest regulations regarding deeds registration and company law, and why only lawyers are capable of drawing up agreements, at least if you get paid for them. Anyone can draw an agreement, but you may not be paid for it, you see. Now, the interesting thing is people believe them. People listen to them. People fall for it. And everyone solemnly and with a straight face goes around the world as if this is not what's actually happening. So the real issue behind virtually every single measure is economics. The motives are economic, and the consequences are economic, and the intended outcomes are economic, but that is very, very seldom discussed. Very seldom on the table, very seldom faced. And it's an interesting question. I don't know if anyone else has, if any of you have a strong view as to why this charade goes on. It's most phenomenal to me. It's a sort of a strange thing about the human mind. Maybe there's a lobe there somewhere which still has to be discovered by neurosurgeons, in which people can sort of repress the sort of obvious, the self-evident. One of the Louw's law of the self-evident is that the trouble with the self-evident is that it isn't self-evident. I'm not sure if it's stupidity. It's very, very wise. I mean, the whole public choice school and the rational expectation school of economists have got very sophisticated economic theories as to why people behave this way. I mean, rational expectationalists, of which I'm not one, but Brian Cantor, for example, is one, have volumes of evidence to suggest that the behavior which both sides go through, those who pretend that they don't know what the others are really motivated by, and those who don't disclose what they're really motivated by, as to that this is actually in everybody's self-interest. George Stigler, who won the Nobel Prize this year, or was it last year? This year, I think, in economics, actually holds, when you look at all this together, that the given state of government regulation and policy and intervention is itself a sort of free market, a consequence of the competing lobbies, vested interests, and so on, and that somehow in this market everybody's better off by playing this game. You see, the reason why lawyers will never point out that accountants are actually charlatans is because then someone will realize they are as well, you see. So there's a sort of unholy alliance that everybody has at actually keeping the secret, keeping this little conspiracy going. It's one of the few conspiracies, by the way, perhaps the only conspiracy, which it seems to be in the interests of the conspirators to maintain. Most other conspiracies seem to be in the self-interest of the members to break away from.
Is it also perpetrated by, or perpetuated by getting at the young in the schools. Children are taught, you know, only doctors may practice medicine, only lawyers, and these are the people to look up to. Nobody else can do what they can. They are the guardians of society.
And yes, and then hence the traditional professions. Never mind that poor old Mozart and Washington and others were killed by doctors who were bloodletting. You know, you say the patient's sick because his blood is toxic, so you let the blood and he gets sicker, so you say we didn't let enough because there's still too many toxins, so you let some more. And but never mind those. I mean, this gets carried over into all these absurd other occupations. Like, I mean, hypertrichologists. You know, who knows what hypertrichologists are? This is my favorite licensed profession. Hypertrichologists are people who remove unsightly hair. Now, you know, before you can remove unsightly hair, you actually have to be qualified in the sciences, and you have to sort of have certain aesthetic attributes and what have you. It's unbelievable. There are about, in South Africa, 250 licensed occupations. Never mind the traditional professions. You know, most people think that unless you're a doctor, you shouldn't do brain surgery. The fact is that most doctors can't do brain surgery anyway, but never mind that. Only a few specialists can, but for some reason we have this view that hapless citizens are going to subject themselves to brain surgery by their neighbor one afternoon, sort of do-it-yourself brain surgery. I just don't have this hypothesis of human beings as being such idiots. It's what I call the other idiot hypothesis, is most people work on the assumption that everyone other than themselves is a moron. Sorry?
What about the doctors, the people who work as doctors that have never been qualified, and it takes them a long time to find out that it's discovered?
Well,
There have been a number of those.
you mean people who aren't formally qualified?
They haven't got qualifications. They pass themselves off, and it takes a long time for them to be found out that they are not in fact qualified for what they're doing.
Well, one of the problems with occupational and professional licensing is that it creates a protection for the professionally incompetent. You see, there's actually a presumption on the part of the public. For example, I'm a qualified lawyer. Now, when I left university, I had not ever seen the Income Tax Act. Never, in my whole life. But I was entitled to open up office and set myself up as a tax consultant. And I was protected from being guilty of fraud, of misrepresenting professional competence. So the public is conned twice over. Once by the false pretense that people have qualifications, and second time round by the complacency about anyone who purports to have qualifications. Someone who says they're a doctor, there's an assumption that Big Brother is sort of policing this some way. I didn't want to discuss the profession so much as just generally in the economic sphere the way these things work. Now, the traditional professions in which a case can be made, I mean, it's I don't think such an easily settled issue. My own view is that if the law just simply said it's fraud to purport to have competence and skill which you do not in fact have, that to my mind would be adequate for all the professions. Just a simple fraud law. But never mind that, that's a bit sort of radical for some people, you know, that sounds crazy and wild. But the trouble is, this whole traditional profession thing then carries on to the others, you see, like painters and carpenters and bricklayers and hypertrichologists and tent makers. And I mean, for example, if you look at the list of licensed occupations in South Africa, you find really quaint people, sort of cute little guilds that one never dreamt existed. One of them that I remember, and I mean, it's really a rich variety of creative thought on the part of some other bureaucrat, but you know, who fortunately ran to our aid and protected us from charlatans parading these qualifications. One of them, for example, is electrical aircraft mechanics in the sugar industry. I mean, there's one, you see. Aeroplanes in the sugar industry have to have special sugar industry electric aircraft mechanics. And no other one can do that job. And then there's one for the building industry. And I mean, it's just unbelievable. Under job reservation, you had to be a qualified, certified painter to paint walls. like wallpaper. Maybe that's why there's so much wallpaper. I don't think that's one of the regulated professions yet. That's interesting. You don't need to be... You do in America, by the way, you do need to be a qualified wallpaperer before you're lawfully allowed to wallpaper. But what you did have with job reservation is not only did you have to be a qualified painter, but blacks would paint the undercoat and whites the overcoat. There's this extra little twist which just adds so much variety and colour and excitement and makes these bureaucrats feel very, very productive human beings. I once published, I don't know, did I mention this as an earlier one, the toilet paper regulations. Now, you might not have known that, but Pretoria has a whole team of little grey men whom I call excretologists. And for our great comfort, delight and happiness during certain times of the day, these excretologists have no doubt conducting very hazardous research upon themselves, have established for us precisely what shape and size toilet sheets have to be, what the breaking strain in Newton's tension has to be, and this is apparently all sort of independent of the size of one's fingers or whatever. I'm not sure, but anyway, you'll be pleased to know. And I once published these regulations. Now, I published them intending for people to see what kind of bizarre, absurd regulation gets cooked up while the public sort of get about their productive business. And somebody said to me, that was such funny satire. They thought I'd invented this. I hadn't. I just quoted it verbatim. And I couldn't persuade anyone that was actually what they say. The core of the roll, you'll be pleased to know, has to be 40 millimeters. The sheets have to be something like 111 millimeters by 103 or whatever. And if it's double ply paper, then it's all sort of different. And the number of sheets per roll. Now, I'd like you all to check on this because someone might be cheating us. You never know. These big greedy capitalists will shortchange us. So will you please all count the number of sheets on your next toilet roll? And let me know. I mean, tick them off one by one as you go or something. In Britain, by the way, if you go to the public toilets there, the toilet paper sheets each one has printed on it government property. Now, I wasn't sure whether this meant you had to return it after use or whatever. But the world of the creative bureaucrat is something to behold. Now, this one can only laugh, but there's one science fiction book that points out that everything we laugh at as a sort of uncomfortable reaction to human frailty and failure. It's very rare that humor is humorous for reasons other than human weakness, frailty, stupidity, failure. I mean, the old slapstick, pie in the face joke or tripping over a bucket joke or whatever, actually characterizes all jokes. Now, when I tell you these things, or many others, you just need to read them, and all you can do is laugh, is because of the incredible discomfort one experiences. I mean, are there really people sitting there at taxpayers' expense, solemnly and seriously around boardroom tables, pondering these issues, while Rome burns? It's sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, you see. For example, there was the Bureau of Standards were lobbied, I think I did mention this, I'll be very brief on it, the 63% copper content regulation for bathroom fittings and taps. I think I mentioned that at a previous session. But you realize that is there some scientific, magically correct amount of copper to be in bathroom fittings and taps, regardless of the local water conditions, the local water pressure conditions, the needs of consumers, whatever, whether there's high acidity or low acidity or whatever, a national standard of 63% copper content in bathroom fittings, I know, and I can assure you, without knowing anything more about it, that the copper industry and a particular tap manufacturer who has a particular method of making taps have got together and lobbied the little grey men in Pretoria, the LGMs as I call them, and persuaded them to pass this regulation, at no time admitting that it's in their vested interest. At all times, no doubt, and I can even I could write the representation for you about how this will protect consumers from buying taps that corrode due to high acidity levels in the Kuruman district or whatever. It's a big farce, but nonetheless, that really is the engine behind every single policy measure, in my opinion, is economics. There is very rarely a policy decision made or a law passed which is not economics, and very rarely one which is not passed at the behest of a vested interest group. May I just deviate for a brief second here and mention, for those, there are some new faces, and it is a bit confusing for them if they have missed what's gone before. The previous sessions for the new faces were the origins of South Africa's problems, in which I outlined my opinion as to how we got here, and in which I said that the two major groups at the moment, the blacks and the Afrikaners, had both had a marvelously coincidental history in which they had actually espoused a high degree of individualism, and that both groups seem to have let that slip, and that is partly the cause of our problem today. I analyzed the status quo, in which I looked at the various political parties, at the economic situation, and while I'm talking about economics, I mentioned there that South Africa is actually a poor performer economically. And I need to repeat that here, is that South Africa is the most richly endowed country in the world per capita with wealth, natural resources, is well located, rich agricultural potential, a fairly average sized population for fairly major, potentially major world population country, and in fact we have not performed as well. We should have been the world's Japan. We started industrializing not long after Japan. We started industrializing not long after many other countries. We were an early one on the industrial path, and we have lagged. South Africa has not performed correctly, and policies are needed for us to perform well in the future. This tells us a lot, incidentally, because one of the main issues for the ANC, whom I discussed, and I discussed the Freedom Charter and the various political groupings from left to right, is that the mines, the mineral wealth, must vest in the hands of the people, meaning Oliver Tambo and or Nelson Mandela. The observation which is worth making there is that the ownership of minerals already vests in the state under the Mining Rights Act, and it is parcelled out anyway to private miners by mining leases, so that we already have what they say should be done, the nationalisation of mining. They too will find, as does any government, that the best way to mine wealth is to contract it out. It's the same way as the best way to build buildings, or the best way to run buses, or the best way to well, I guess there's not much that you can't successfully contract out. I then did discuss my master plan for solving the South African problem, which was essentially the Swiss canton system, dividing South Africa up into something like 200 cantons, each with their own autonomous powers, including their power over economic policy, which I'm going to discuss in detail now. And then sorry, it stopped. There we are. And then I discussed the legal order, in which I discussed various rights, civil liberties, and so on. So, for those who weren't here, there's an assumption I'll be making from this point on that all of you have the knowledge about what's gone before. Now, I'm going to use my same mind map method of presentation again. in discussing more conceptually the status quo in the economic order. The status quo for whites, firstly. The status quo for whites is that it is a sort of capitalism. It was said, I think, by Richard Maponya, or it doesn't matter, Sam Matsunyani, Tutu, not important who, some other black person, that South Africa has white capitalism and black socialism. The assumption, unfortunately, is that whites have economic and other freedoms in South Africa. An assumption is that if you could simply extend to blacks whatever whites have, blacks will be better off. This is a very strange and incorrect view. For example, look at education, where what blacks want, the demand is apparently for the same education that whites get, on the assumption that that is a good education, whereas the evidence before us suggests that you can achieve that it's actually a very cost-ineffective education. It is virtually the most expensive method of education, the most expensive per capita education in the world, and there are very few people who think that it's the best in the world. So there and in other things, other types of blacks assume that whites are free of all the controls that blacks experience and blacks are unhappy about. But in fact, let us question that. I want to first look at the parastatals. We all know we have Eskom, Escor, SATS. SATS, of course, entails a whole labyrinth of controls over the economy, transport regulations, airline regulation, shipping regulation, road haulage. For example, a prohibition on private building of railway lines under the Railways and Harbours Act, or whatever it's called. No railway line may be built without Parliament's consent, never mind even the Minister's consent, Parliament's consent. For what it's worth, ISCOR is above the law, and when it built the Saldanha-Sishen railway line, it didn't get anybody's consent, not even SATS. And it built it on a different gauge railway line, found it couldn't run it, and now has to hand it over to SATS, who now has to run two sets of standards. Harbours, of course, is another thing that falls under SATS. In many countries of the world, like Britain, for example, you find private and government harbours. For what it's worth, the private harbours, which were never nationalised, not even by Harold Wilson. In fact, while Harold Wilson was nationalising things like British Steel and railways and telecom and other things, we were fond of accusing them of being socialists, whereas they were only getting towards what we already had. But if you take the harbours, British harbours, the private ones have a very high growth rate, they're very efficient, and they are outstripping the government ones without any subsidies. In fact, they're profit-making business ventures. So that we tend to have these assumptions in South Africa, these sacred cows. If you say to somebody we should have private harbours, we're so used to harbours being run by the state, it's almost inconceivable that harbours could be private business ventures, competing with each other, deciding for themselves whether to containerize or go for ro-ro or go for bulk handling or whatever. It can indeed be so. Many people say the private sector can't afford big capital projects. Well, that's of course nonsense. Gold mines are bigger than harbours. Gold mines have longer lead times to become profitable. And also the biggest container harbour in the world is currently being built in Hong Kong entirely privately. And Hong Kong is a smaller economy in every sense in terms of natural resources, population, geography, GNP, etc. than South Africa. Then of course the control boards. Now we always think of the well-known 22 control boards, the agricultural boards, the meat board, the maize board, the banana board, the dairy board, etc. And then there's the bean board and the dried bean board and the soya bean board and the has-been board and heaven knows what all. But those are not the only ones. There are about 200 control boards in South Africa, of which those 22 are only 10%. There are many, many other boards, and for example, KWV, sugar, timber, etc., and other kinds of products, transport boards, rent boards, and many more. About 200, according to Dr. Norval, when he was chairman of the Board of Trade. That was about 15 years ago, and by now there are a number added. Then a thing like water, you know, again, it's a sacred cow. Water has to be run by the state. It's a public good, etc., etc. Natural monopoly, we have all these arguments. But in fact, right now in San Diego in America, there are two water companies competing with each other. Water in the Witwatersrand itself was private. The Rand Mines Water Supply Company was taken nationalized in order to create the Rand Slaughter Board, as I call it, or the Rand Water Board, as it's officially known. Then many of you will know the very distinctive Northcliffe Water Tower that stands up on Osville Kop over there. And you'll know that Northcliffe has, amongst others, Frederick Drive is a sort of main road through Northcliffe. Now, Frederick Drive is named after Frederick Cohen, who was the owner and builder of the Northcliffe Water Tower, like many others. That's just one that's close by. Next time you see it, look at it as a monument to private enterprise in water reticulation. The whole northern water system was built by Frederick Cohen, along with Berario and Northcliffe and so on townships. He was eventually, after a tremendous resistance, he was simply expropriated. He was running a very highly profitable and efficient water supply system, and after he was taken over, lo and behold, in real terms, the water rates went up, the water supply started making a loss, and all kinds of things that you can predict would happen. At least, no, maybe you don't. I predict, but for some reason other people don't. Other people continue to have this extraordinary faith that somehow governments can do these things better. Then there are things like SAF Marine. We're here in the SPDC building, the Development Bank, and many, many other parastatals, state corporations, projects, things like a huge one, by the way, is the South African Development Trust, the old Bantu Trust, that owns enormous extensive land in South Africa. It's by far the single biggest landowner and regulates, probably is the People Control Board with the most extensive power in South Africa. And the regulations under that act that govern half the population living in the rural areas and own the land and control the land is quite horrific. It's interesting to me that in all the talk in South Africa, the Group Areas Act, influx control, mixed marriages, this and that, the whole Development Trust and Land Act has not featured in the press. It's as if the press don't know it's there, but that is actually the major source of control over blacks. And then, of course, there are these others, agricultural controls, when you may plant, what you may plant. You know, for example, I wanted to buy a timber farm once with my brother, and we found that there are 7 points of control from planting to selling. Now, if I asked you to think of 7 ways in which to control timber, I doubt if you'd come up with 7. I mean, what controls could you have, you see? Now, firstly, you need a permit to plant at all. Then you need a permit to trim, and then you need a permit to cut, and then you need a permit to saw, and then you need a permit to transport, and then you need a permit to sell, etc., etc. Timber, by the way, is one of our unregulated agricultural products. It doesn't have a control board. It's just simply the minister's men, the men from the ministry. Then the plus and the minus here, incidentally, is whether in recent years, say the last 5 years, there has been an increase of control or a decrease of control in these areas. So with agriculture, there's been a net increase. Rent control, there's been a net reduction of rent controls, and it's now only applicable to buildings occupied before 1940. Who knows? Is it something like 49? Okay. And it was at one time up to 1966. And so that's been rolled back, and it would have been abolished entirely, by the way, soon after the last general election, when the Progressive Party, who'd supported the phasing out of rent control, electioneered and tried to capture some points by opposing the final removal under the sunset clause, and that was a very unfortunate thing. So we said we're still stuck with these funny little rent boards that ensure, by the way, that guarantee that old pensioners, little old ladies whose sole asset in life is a a duplex house left to them by their husband are insured that they will never get a financial return on their assets. I mean, people always assume that landlords are big, wealthy people. The majority of landlords, I don't have the figure, but I think it's likely to be true, that numerically the majority of landlords are people as poor as the tenants, or at least people in a similar socio-economic group to the tenants. Most of them are private homeowners, cottage owners, little old blocks of flats in all sorts of suburbs, southern suburbs. One mustn't think of landlords as the owners of large apartment blocks. Numerically, they're probably a minority. Interest rate controls, there was a reduction recently. There's been an increase of control again. And that includes everything, what kinds of agreements you may enter into, what terms of payment, etc. Now let me run through these. There's licensing controls. I've mentioned the occupations. By the way, there's a lobby of travel agents now that is trying to get the act repealed that was introduced about 3 years ago to govern them. And the very, very first occupational licensing that I'm aware of that the government did not grant, you see, whoever you are, I mean, say you're window cleaners, you see, and you say, well, we must protect the public from inefficient window cleaners or from being ripped off by window cleaners or whatever. Any little group that can get together has been able in the last 10 years to get the government to pass an act regulating them, which means to pass an act keeping out competitors. That's really what all these acts do. These little guild socialism, it used to be called in the Dark Ages. Actually, what kept the world in the Dark Ages was this sort of thing. The very first and only one that the government has ever refused was in insurance brokers and agents. And that I regard as a major breakthrough, and I hope that more will come. Then there's business licensing. We all know, maybe not the detail, but of course restrictive barriers to running any number of businesses, liquor licenses, whatever. Import controls have been increased.
What was the reason for them refusing insurance brokers?
Well, there was actually there were two major groups in the insurance industry. One is Louw, Life Underwriters Association of South Africa, who happened to have in its executive 2 years ago people who were firm free market ideologists, people who believed in the free market as a matter of principle, although they recognized that regulation of the insurance brokers business would serve their financial economic self-interest. And they, along with my assistance, Free Market Foundation's assistance, lobbied the government against the other groups in the insurance business, the employers, the Life Officers Association and one or two others, Insurance Brokers Association, who were trying to get the legislation, and they went and pointed out to the government that such legislation is anti-consumer, pro-insider. And the government saw it, but never before had there actually been a lobby of that kind. And I think, in other words, the charade was sort of exposed. The veil was pierced. That but for this group, nobody would have been there to point out that it's a big hoax. It would have passed through as being to protect people from quack insurance agents. The rhetoric is so impressive, so tantalizing. But when you actually read the legislation, it's got nothing to do with protecting the public. It's got to do with protecting the insiders of the profession.
The excuse often given by government, I want you to comment on this, is that government require one body to speak to, in other words, to deal with. They say they can't deal with the mass of the market. Broker A here, a broker B there, a broker C down in Cape Town. How do you deal with that criticism? I mean, given the fact that government does exist.
Well, question one is, surely we should prevail upon the government that in terms of its own constitution, one of the national goals is effective competition and private enterprise. So in other words, the government, if it wants one voice, then it should A, repeal that act, and B, repeal the competition board. Because it should be pointed out that in fact there is competition, that in fact there is not one voice. It is completely socialistic, fascistic.
I'm going to be a devil's advocate for the moment, but they will say, for instance, we would want to pass legislation relating to the We need to consult with somebody within the insurance industry.
Yes,
Therefore, we need a body.
lazy bureaucrats do indeed say that. I mean, it's much nicer to sit together with Joe Bloggs and have tea and shake hands and say, yes, it's nice to agree with you and we'll pass this act that you drafted. It's much nicer to do that than to have to deal with the real world, which is hundreds and hundreds of different interest groups. So it is in the interests of bureaucrats. Well, it's in the interests of bureaucrats to recognize X, Y, or Z group as the representative group, which then supposedly speaks with one voice, quote unquote. But we know that is just simply not the real world. We know that's a con and a bluff. Sorry?
It's a convenience factor for the bureaucrat.
It's convenient for the bureaucrat. It serves the interests of usually the middle order operator, in other words, the average broking firm, who are numerically usually the most, then get away of knocking the big firm and knocking the... If you take the estate agents board as a good example, you know, to force Randmines Properties and others to join the institute, to pay the dues, all the directors have to pass exams before they can carry on being estate agents and so on. Also to stop the housewife who operates out of her home during the property boom. So you solidify the market, you create an entry barrier so that when the property market rises and falls, there's no response to the rise and fall. There's no competition, there's no innovation, there's no use of computers. It's sort of like, you know, we just, in countries where this isn't regulated, you now have sort of computer dating of buyers and sellers of insurance policies or of homes or whatever. In other words, you go along to a bureau and for a very, very small fee, you say, I want a house with 4 bedrooms and a sauna and a tingle tub and a swimming pool and a tennis court and a floodlight out the back and a double garage and, you know, wall plugs in every room or whatever, and you put it in and the computer spews out a list of 20 that satisfy your specs in the area that interests you, and off you go. You don't need estate agents. You see, they actually get superseded eventually by technology. So one of the things you want to do is prevent that. Just such a thing had just opened, operating at a 2% commission in the Carlton Centre, and one of the effects of the Act was to close them down, or more precisely to force them to charge the institute rate to become members, and to you know, clearly anti-consumer behaviour, clearly pro-insider behaviour, the prevention of new technology, new methods and so on. So now the government would like one unified, uniform bunch. That's human nature.
Yeah, there's 2 very good examples of this. When South Africa decided to go metric and to change over its system from pound shillings and pennies into rands and cents, when the country was faced with metrification of all the equipment that was then handling pound shillings and pence, and then subsequently again when we changed over everything from pounds and ounces to kilograms and grams. And the government in fact more or less forced the scale traders, and there were hundreds of them, not only the big manufacturers of weighing equipment, but hundreds and hundreds of little guys all over the country who were doing repairs and maintenance on these machines, were pushed into forming an association just for the purpose of the government being able to deal with one body that would then coordinate this whole business of metrication. And at the same time, there was actually massive handouts made because the government paid these scale traders to do the job. And so there was a very strong ability from the government's point of view to push the industry into doing that. Big incentive of saying, well, if you guys will just get together and form one group that we can talk to quickly, there's this big amount of money that we're waiting to hand out to you to do this job.
Yeah.
You can't do it until you form the group. Now that group was formed for that purpose in the 60s, and it still exists today.
Well, it's in keeping with things. I've made notes of that. By the way, if I make notes while someone's talking, it's because I just want to not rely. My daughter says she's got a good memory and I have a good forgettery, so I don't want to have to rely on my forgettery. Thank you. Yes, the the national motto is unity is strength. And as Rupert has suggested, we change it to diversity is strength. And I think this idea that somehow unity, uniformity, monotony, it's one correct, perfect solution is so very tempting. It's easy, it's lazy, it's not threatening, vested interests are safe, bureaucracies are safe, old technology gets slotted in forever. Wassenaar has called the South African Railways the world's biggest museum. We just sort of freeze history. Terry Markman has made the point that we're fortunate that the government did not run the wagon industry. Otherwise, we would never have had motor cars and trucks and aeroplanes and buses and things. We'd still be using wagons because we need to protect the capital and the employees and the technology and so on and so forth. Anyway, imports, there was a decrease, now there's been an increase of import controls, including tariffs. Money, that includes foreign exchange. There was a decline of controls, now there's an increase taking place again very recently. Labour, at least as regards whites, there's been a reduction of regulations and controls, except, of course, for the increase of things like occupational safety laws, minimum wage laws, industrial council agreements imposed upon non-consenting people. But in the sense of the new labour dispensation, in a way is a deregulation. My own view is it's deregulation relative to what there was before, but in my own view what we should have gone is for the Japanese model, which is where the labour movement is organised by firm rather than by industry. In other words, instead of having all boilermakers belonging to a union, you have all employees of Anglo-American belonging to a union or whatever. There's no logic in all boilermakers belonging to a union because clearly all boilermakers don't have a common interest with other boilermakers. The boilermakers in one company have an interest with each other, a self-interest with each other, and their competitors are not their employer but the boilermakers in another company or another industry. And this idea that you have a national union of mine workers or whatever is a sort of Marxist myth that there's some kind of inherent solidarity of the working class.
Doesn't that depend on the mobility of labour? Because if there's a great mobility of labour, then it would depend on it. But where it isn't, then what you say.
Well, it depends on what you mean by mobility of labour, whether you mean labour is permitted to move.
Yes,
or not permitted to move.
The old journeyman idea was, I remember my uncle used to move from firm to firm very easily.
Yeah. Yes, I think that partly the labour legislation that we have reduces mobility at law of labour, but it's doubtful whether if you take Japan, for example, where there's no constraint on mobility at law, in fact, the labour force is highly immobile. People work for one company for their whole lives. It's like sort of being a civil servant, or your children go into the same company or whatever. And that's why I would have gone for the whole Japanese approach. It works, it's more moral, it's more free, it's more consistent with the ordinary principles of justice, equity, freedom of contract, and all sorts of pro-democratic ideas. The system whereby one contract is imposed upon all, regardless of whether they've participated, is a high degree of regulation, high degree of government intervention, but in the sense that people may now choose more freely which trade unions they join or what races they admit. In that sense, there's been some deregulation, but maybe this is not clearly one or the other. Minimum standards and various standards of regulation have been massively increased in recent times. Building standards, there's now a National Building Standards Act with building standards imposed all over the country. So even if Pofadder used to permit prefabs, or Arnslate used to permit wood frame houses, or Van Sales Hoek used to permit corrugated iron roofs or whatever, the little grey men, the LGMs in Pretoria, have decided to clamp down on that, and now everyone will do the same thing regardless, except of course the state, which exempts itself from its own controls, so that all of the houses the state builds are slums by definition, which, as I said at an earlier stage, is one of the problems with privatizing them. You can't, if you create freehold title in Soweto and sell the houses under freehold title, they'll all have to be ploughed down the next day, because they're all contraventions of the building standard regulations. They don't have double layer walls, they don't have ceilings, they don't have gutters, they don't have tiled roofs and whatever. Price controls, this is one area in which South Africa really has performed heroically. There's been a massive reduction of price control from in the order of 200,000 controlled prices in about 1976 when it peaked. Sorry, I need the trouble is they make round pens, which is when it peaked down to at the moment there are about 16 prices controlled under the Price Control Act, plus of course a couple of other controlled prices like agricultural products. But even there, not many are controlled, by the way. The maize price is controlled, but there are only about 3 controlled agricultural prices. The others are floor prices or auction prices, or what they call surplus verwijdering, whatever that is in English, so surplus removal or selling.
It's still the critical one.
Sorry?
It's still the critical one.
Petrol.
Yeah.
Yes, petrol is a very, very completely unnecessary price to control. I don't know why they continue, but nonetheless, yes, petrol is one. There are some very important ones under specific legislation. That's under the National Resources Procurement Act or whatever. But price control is virtually gone. There are a few staple products with price control. By the way, in 1976, I tried to find out which prices are controlled. Now, firstly, Johannesburg in 1976 did not have a price controller at all. So I couldn't phone the Joburg price controller and find out. So I went to the price controller in Pretoria, who was then Joop Steyn, and it turned out that even Pretoria couldn't tell you which prices were controlled. So we had price control, but no one knew what the controlled prices were or which products were controlled. To give an example, it was done by category. Now, one of them was photographic parts and equipment. So that every little screw in your camera, you see, had a controlled price, hypothetically. But nobody had ever gotten around to deciding what it should be, or, and then the trouble is, there was this deluge, and I wonder if they haven't reintroduced price control to sweets. They might have, because I've noticed recently one of the symptoms of price control in the sweet market, which is that people just bring out new products. You see, if your woozy bar is controlled at 5 cents, well, what you do is you change the package and you change the shape and you call it a woggy bar, and you sell woggy bars. You see, then that gets a price control slapped on it. Then you bring out a wiggy bar and a wimpy bar and a googie bar, and so there was this sort of like frogs, as you jump to catch it, it jumps away, and the price controller just never caught up. There are a couple of things like cement. Well, it's hard to bring out different shapes and sizes of cement granules and so on, but certainly with everything else, tremendous waste took place with people just bringing out new products and new shapes and sizes, and the price controller with 5 staff members trying to monitor 200,000 prices. Another one of these crazy, bizarre ideas. Nice in theory, protect the little old consumer who's too dumb to look after themselves and so on, but there we are. Yeah.
One that I feel there is a case for, and that is safety control.
Oh, well, that comes under standards. Yes, maybe, but again, the common law really controls safety. My own view is the common law is adequate. In other words, it is unlawful to make an unsafe structure or to endanger public safety or health, which is an objective test. But what you do have now is you have some specification, for example, that a certain kind of partitioning is safe. Well, what that means is that materials technology gets ground to a halt, or at least slowed down, because now nobody has it's very, very costly. There's an enormous extra cost in developing a new material for partitioning or whatever. There was one standard that Walter Williams mentions in America, which was safety specs for for baby wear, where it was said that baby wear needed to be at least, all baby wear had to be fireproof, non-flammable. Now that's kind of nice. I mean, none of us like, babies burning. It's sort of, not quite one's view about a compassionate society. So most people universally welcome non-flammable baby wear, minimum standards for baby wear. However, the real world has a way of kicking back. And the minimum standard had the effect that lower income groups could no longer afford baby wear, because high standards have a price. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free standard. So the lower income groups were either clothing their babies in homemade flammable garments, or not clothing them at all, and infants in the very cold parts of America, infant mortality rates went up during winter as a result of this sort of regulation. And then you take a safety, there are many other examples, by the way, that have been documented where the imposition of minimum standards, safety standards of various kinds, has been entirely counterproductive. But I'm going to give you a nice amusing one, the introduction of seat belts, compulsory seat belts. Now, Terry Markman has the unorthodox view amongst libertarian free market people who tend to think that you should control your own body and decide for yourself whether or not you wear a seatbelt. His view is that the road owner decides, and if the state happens to be the road owner, like an aeroplane owner decides, when you fly on a private airline, they'd say fasten your seatbelt, and if you don't want to, they kick you off because it's part of their insurance agreement. So on. So the market certainly can provide compulsory seatbelt regulations. And I don't know, the autostrada in Italy are all privately owned, the freeways, and either it's governed by state road regulations, but even if it weren't, there's a high chance that the private road owners would impose a seatbelt law. But it turns out that, again, one of these things, statistics came out about how fatalities of drivers declined after compulsory seatbelt wearing was introduced in various countries. It all seemed to be working very nicely. It then transpired some years later, when further figures were gathered, that the fatality rates of non-drivers started going up, pedestrians, cyclists, users of other cars. And the reason is presumably that people wearing seatbelts feel safer and more secure, so they drive more dangerously. So that the trade-off was that the seatbelt wearer is better off, but everyone else is worse off. And about 60% of road accident deaths, incidentally, are non-occupants of cars, pedestrians, cyclists, and so on. At least in the USA, I think in South Africa it's close to 50-50. So when you hear of car accidents over the Easter weekend or someone, one tends to think that those are occupants, but it's more often than not non-occupants. Now, Gordon Tullock, who's one of my favorite economists in America, and a very creative thinker, when these figures came to light, said, well, he invented what's now called in economics the Tullock safety device. Now, the Tullock safety device is a brilliant contraption, incidentally, fully guaranteed to reduce road accidents to absolute almost zero. And what it is a dagger that sticks out of the steering column and stops 1 inch short of the driver's chest. And the driver is forbidden from wearing a safety belt. And, and Tullock predicts, I think correctly, that the number of road accidents will drop precipitously. The number of impaled drivers would increase, but the number of road accidents and fatalities in general will diminish almost to zero. And people will drive very, very safely. Speeding will become almost non-existent. So anyway, often these safety standards aren't what you think they are. They tend to have a sort of way of kicking back at you. So next time you put on your safety belt, just try and imagine that you're actually using the Tullock safety device, and you'll be doing the rest of the public a great big favor. Because, I mean, I don't know if you feel it, but I feel it if I don't wear a safety belt. I do actually feel less secure psychologically. So there we are. Sorry? Oh, but you don't know about the seatbelt rebel in Pretoria. You know, my watch keeps going off the stop. There we are. The seatbelt rebel Van Grienen, who was a member of the Free Market Foundation, sort of a past member, now late lamented Van Grienen, I mean still alive but no longer a member. The reason he's no longer a member is because we didn't oppose the introduction of compulsory seatbelts. Now Van Grienen believed that the state can violate his rights in any number of ways, can take his property, can force his children into compulsory detention without trial called schooling, can do all kinds of things. But the one thing Van Grienen would not condone was what he called the nationalization of his body, which was compulsory seatbelts. You see, he thought that was the state actually nationalizing his body. So he sent, on the day the law was to be enforced, he sent a telex to the Minister of Transport, Hendrik Skuman, firstly nominating him for the annual Karl Marx Award, and secondly informing him that he had no intention of wearing his seatbelt, and he wanted that to be known. And he owns a fairly sizable steel door factory in Pretoria, just across the road from Iscor. And he said that if he was fined, he would take it to court and he would appeal and he would fight it all the way to the appellate division, and every way along the way he would dismiss 5% of his workers, and ultimately if he lost in the AD he would actually blow up his factory and leave South Africa. Now he felt a lot stronger about it than most of us, but good old Van Grienen actually drove out of his factory that afternoon to be met by some Pretoria traffic cops who promptly fined him. And he did in fact proceed to fight the case. And when it got to the Supreme Court they withdrew because it was getting very embarrassing. He was standing up there talking about civil rights and individual freedom and nationalizing his body and the Karl Marx Award and all sorts of things, all of which was inadmissible evidence, but they couldn't stop him, you see. So they then withdrew on the technicality that they didn't know what year his car was manufactured, and you only have to... So lo and behold, Van Grienen was very miserable. He thought he'd been denied his right to blow up his factory. So he said to them, he stood up and he said, I'm leaving this court without my seatbelt on, and I insist on being charged again because I insist on this case being properly heard on the merits, you see. So anyway, he drove around for about a month, and the cops in Pretoria had all been told, don't fine Van Grienen, whatever you do. So anyway, eventually old George, I mean, he's a real rugged Afrikaner. I mean, he's my impression of a real voortrekker. That's what I think is a sort of voortrekker relic. He's got all the genes in him and stuff. He behaved just the way a voortrekker would if they told him to wear a seatbelt on a wagon. But anyway, he then used to drive around and he dangled his seatbelt out the window whenever he saw cops. And they all knew him. He was old cranky George, you know. But anyway, one day, lo and behold, and the suspicion is, although of course nobody knows, but there's just the suspicion, it is rumored that some new fledgling cop in the Pretoria Traffic Department was bribed by George Van Grienen to fine him for not wearing his seatbelt. So the case started all over again. And I think eventually it was withdrawn again. And now I believe they're no longer prosecuting unless you actually get caught for something else, like in a speed trap or whatever. I think as a result of heroic George, they now leave us generally in peace.
That wasn't the case in Johannesburg.
Are they actually fining now?
You find in Rosebank these days.
Are you? Oh, well, we need to get George over. I'll call him. I'll call him in. Call in the sort of, it's like Ghostbusters. We'll get in the seatbelt buster. So yes, that's not quite economic policy, but I think you can see how economists can address the issue of standards, the Tulloch safety device. Now that's often interesting how human psychology is. Another one I heard is that video hire companies are now starting to hire the videos machines out without the cases, because the psychology of people is that if it's in a case they drop it and break it and so on, but if they actually have to carry this vulnerable looking thing, they actually look after, they have a lower breakage rate. So minimum standards, wherever they are, tend not to work. and and they tend to be counterproductive. They tend to raise the cost of providing jobs, therefore creating unemployment or reducing wage rates, reducing investment, and what's more, they discriminate against small business. You know, if some backyard mechanic doesn't have a stretcher or first aid kit or whatever, then he's at a big disadvantage. Now, the position regarding blacks, and I've got to move on fast over here. The position regarding blacks, firstly, in the homelands, the status quo is that blacks in the homelands have, as I said in an earlier session, essentially Marxism. That is, a bigger percentage of the economy is under state ownership or control than in most Eastern Bloc countries. All of the land is state owned and controlled. Sorry. In the homelands, blacks essentially have a Marxist system. Roughly, give or take, 80% of the national product is in state ownership or control. All of the land, 100% is, which is more than has been achieved in any Eastern Bloc country, and I think is really quite a horrifying fact, statistical fact, which does not seem to have alarmed the people who have in their minds. I mean, the person who votes for the government really, I'm sure, does not want to create Marxist homelands. I'm sure if you go and ask some HNP voter in the Waterberg whether they have any objection to the homelands having what I call equivalence, having the same law applicable to blacks as applies to whites, the same economic system, I'm sure they'd say, but isn't that what happens anyway? Isn't there separate but equal? That, after all, is all that the voter had in mind. But what the voter has got, without knowing it usually, is one of the most perfect embodiments of Marxism ever achieved in reality on earth, in the homelands. There is a system of immense corruption, just like in any communist country, political patronage. Only people who are friends or relatives or party supporters or whatever get licenses or permits or sites, and so on. The Ciskei and Botswana have had some deregulation, and I put a question mark simply because the question might be asked, what about them, and the exclamation mark, because they are examples of how I think the canton system would work, by competition amongst different local governments or state governments or canton governments for the right political system. And people who complain about the departures, especially in Ciskei, from the South African system, really should welcome some controlled experiment. Let's see if it works. And so far it looks as if it's working. Ciskei and Botswana do have higher growth rates, lower unemployment, more houses being produced, less unrest, and so on and so forth. In the townships, the real problem in the townships is...
Just on that side there, the 80% state control or owned is one of the major reasons why there's been so little economic development in the homelands, because people have not got security of tenure.
That's right.
And very often what has happened traditionally is if a man improves the piece of land that he's been allocated, then the brother or some relative or friend of the chief will eventually inherit it from him.
Right.
And this has definitely been a major factor in stopping economic development.
Yeah, I agree. I would just add to that the whole system of business regulation and licensing. In other words, before someone can start a panel beating business or give extra typing lessons or run a butchery or whatever, there's in the order of 30 approvals that are needed in most cases. That takes a minimum of 2 years and a cost of perhaps thousands, because you have to sustain yourself by other means during this process. I mean, the obstacle to enter business, and then you're only allowed one business usually, only on one site, which you personally have to occupy. Only since 1979, which I'll come to, have they been able to run a company. I mean, prior to 79, there was less private enterprise, less free enterprise, less capitalism by standard textbook definition in the national states than probably in any part of the globe. Red China, Cuba, you name it, Bulgaria, North Vietnam, or whatever. I mean North Korea. In the townships, the real problem, I believe, is not so much segregation as discretionary law. There is no objective law. I've dealt with that under the legal order, and I won't go into it again. Pre-1979, the law essentially was only one small shop and no land ownership or no security of tenure or no leasehold or whatever. No exchangeable land, no mortgageable land, no secure tenure of land. Those, to my mind, are the three characteristics which land has to have for an economy to prosper. Efficient use of land is the sufficient and necessary condition for progress. And the land to be efficiently used needs to be mortgageable, vendable, and lettable, whatever you call it, whether you call it leasehold or freehold or quit rent or deed of grant or whatever is unimportant. Post-1979, at least in the townships, the introduction of the 99-year lease came, still very, very restrictive, can't be freely sold, can't be speculated in, can't be developed, you can't become a black landlord, you can't build a block of flats, you can't whatever in Soweto. The 49-51 shareholding thing came in, 49% whites and 51% blacks for the first time. They could register companies, they could own taxis, and various other decontrols came. They could own industries. Prior to 1979, the only business that a black could do, you could not do anything else lawfully, was run one small, I think it was 400 square meters maximum size, general dealership, which was not allowed to compete with another. It had to be at least 4 kilometers from the next one. So there was, and that is why in black, I mean, you know, the question should be asked, I think, it's a very unorthodox view, that in fact the Group Areas Act is relatively unimportant. If it had been there all these years, but blacks were free in their areas as whites have been, then Soweto today would be a big bustling metropolis city like any other in the world. The reason no black town has a central business district, no entertainment complexes, theatre complexes, none of the characteristics of a city, is because of these discretionary controls and the control over land allocation and the limited licensing of businesses and so on.
Bjorn, could I just add there that it was only the Institute of Race Relations that was advocating some such system in the 1930s in order to help blacks.
What, you mean not having?
A system of protection.
Oh, yeah, the zoning law and so on. Yes, well, it's a sort of unholy alliance that we've had in South Africa between the radical left and the radical right. You know, they're all for slum clearance. They're all for protection, for paternalism of blacks, etc. There's actually very little difference between the white left and the white right when it comes to African policy. They just label it differently. The whites just say it's to preserve white identity, and the white liberals say it's to protect blacks from exploitation by whites. That was an origin of, for example, the Section 16 of the Immorality Act was supposed to be to protect helpless black women from being seduced by ruthless white men. You see, I mean, you can't really have, I mean, white men are so sort of sexy and persuasive and handsome and whatever, and they'd go around sort of ravaging all these helpless black women, and that really was believed. It was really believed that unless it was prohibited, these black women would be the helpless victims of white seducers. Anyway, that often this protection motive, the paternalist motive, is the paternal welfare state, socialist state, tends to end up with the same effects as the apartheid policy has produced for blacks, and hence the homelands are impeccable Marxist states, subsidized or government-owned transport, staple foods, housing, labor allocation, training, education, clinics, hospitals, etc., etc. A massive wealth redistribution. I mentioned in an earlier one that prior to 1970, South Africa endured or had the biggest wealth redistribution probably in history as a percentage of national product, which was largely from whites to blacks. According to the figures of Mike McGrath, who's a fairly left-wing academic at Natal University, and blacks did not progress. Since 1970, the wealth redistribution from whites to blacks has diminished dramatically, but there have been these reforms that I mentioned earlier, and the white share of the national product has increased, so that it's a pretty impressive testimony, I think, to the power of the superiority of the market over wealth redistribution, that what blacks have really benefited by is not wealth redistribution, but economic liberation. The case for a free market, you all know, it depoliticizes, it liberates, it produces high growth. It's a discovery process. It's the only way to discover the best methods, the best technology, the best products. There's no other known way under central planning. The failure of planning is manifest all over the world. Sandy White gave me a book before we started.